Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья! I often describe Russian literature as a massive punch in the face because these Russian writers were truth tellers, no matter how painful and uncomfortable were those truths. The reason for that is the country has an extreme climate. Cold, harsh reality sets every winter. So despite lofty, cushiony ideas of freedom, individualism, equality, and so on trickling down from the West, these Russian novelists understood that reality always comes to bite you no matter how lofty are your beliefs. These Russian writers were poets of reality, and reality is always messy. This is a very long video, so in part 1 I'll discuss 4 giants of Russian literature, starting with Eugen Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, who, as the father of modern Russian literature, single-handedly revolutionized the literature of a vast country. Then I'll discuss A Hero of Our Time by Mikhail Lermontov, often considered the second most beloved poet of Russia. Then I'll come to Nikolai Gogol's satirical stories, mainly his masterpiece The Dead Souls, as well as Ivan Goncharov's novel Oblomov, another classic of Russian satire. In part 2, I'll talk about another 4 giants of Russian literature, starting with Ivan Turgenev, one of the most artistic of Russian writers. His masterpiece, Fathers and Sons, inspired both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky to write their greatest novels. I'll also talk about Fyodor Dostoevsky, perhaps the most psychological Russian writer who influenced later generations of writers from around the world. I'll talk about his most influential novel, The Brothers Karamazov. Then I'll look at the works by Leo Tolstoy, the giant of Russian literature. I'll discuss his War and Peace. Unlike the psychological tales of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy was more concerned with the sociological questions concerning what forces move history and civilization, as well as the role of an individual within a society. Finally, I'll discuss Anton Chekhov, the father of short stories, whose tales have been immensely influential in cinema. By the end of this video, you will know all the major Russian classics as well as some of the most influential novelists from the Russian-speaking world. This video will give you all the juicy stuff from Russian literature. If you have read this video, it will connect a lot of dots. If you have not read, it connects dots about life and its meaning and purpose in general. Russian literature is truly universal because these writers went deep, really deep into the human psyche to dissect all manner of themes from politics, history, social change to crime, guilt, and redemption. So get yourself some vodka and let me take you on a journey spanning 100 years of Russian brilliance. By the way, if you want to buy the script of this video in a book format, you can find the link down below. This also supports the channel, so thank you very much. No writer is more dear to the Russians than this man. He was a grandson of an African man, but also a playboy, a brat, arrogant man who spoke better French than Russian. To make his French connection even more interesting, he was killed by a Frenchman in a duel. Most importantly, this man invented a new literary Russian language that was more precise, clearer, and simpler, which made him the poet of the Russian people. The Tsar left him, so did the Soviet leaders like Lenin and Stalin, and Tchaikovsky, the greatest Russian composer, wrote an opera based on his work. Alexander Pushkin is considered the father of Russian literature, the Shakespeare of Russia, whose poetry captured the spirit of Russia, who influenced subsequent writers like Lermontov, Gogol, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. His most famous work is Eugen Onegin, a novel in verse. Today I'll answer the following questions. Who was Pushkin? What is Eugen Onegin about? I'll summarize it and discuss its major themes. I'll also answer how and why Pushkin captured the imagination of the Russian people. Pushkin also posed a few interesting questions such as, is human existence nothing but a contradiction? Do we all want happiness or struggle in anguish? And are smart, learned people really stupid and less happy because they suppress their natural inclinations? At the end, I'll read one of his most famous poems that nearly all Russians know by heart. First, let me tell you a little bit about Pushkin's life and death, which I think he might have somewhat subconsciously predicted in his own masterpiece. Alexander Pushkin was born in Moscow in 1799 into an aristocratic family somewhat similar to English romantic poet Lord Byron, whom Pushkin admired very much. Pushkin's great-grandfather was Ibrahim Ganibal, an army general born in modern-day Cameroon, but kidnapped as a child by the Ottomans and later gifted to the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great. He grew up to become one of the highest-ranking Russian generals, so Pushkin was very proud of his African ancestry and depicted in a short story, The More of Peter the Great, and also a poem titled My Genealogy. Pushkin grew up in and around St. Petersburg. He was educated primarily in French like all the Russian aristocrats at the time. At a young age, he showed great talent in writing. His French education allowed him to read Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau. As a result, he acquired a liberal attitude towards social change. His radical social activities were flagged to the government and he was pushed out of St. Petersburg, so he traveled to the south, the Caucasus, the Crimea, and Moldova, where he became a Freemason and later got himself involved in the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Turks. But when he found himself in Odessa, he seduced the governor's wife, so the Russian authorities forced him back to his family estate. This exile or house arrest allowed him to focus on his poetry, the solitude and isolation he needed to cultivate his craft of writing poetry, of longing and loneliness. This is a lesson. If you want to be a writer with deep thoughts, you ought to live in isolation for a bit so you can travel deep inside your own psyche or the subconscious. In 1825, there was a coup against the government which became known as the Decembrist Revolt, in which many Russian aristocrats rebelled against the Tsar, but failed. Pushkin was implicated through one of his poems, so he was summoned to Moscow. But this proved to be a reversal of fortune. The Tsar was very impressed with the young Pushkin's honesty and immediately employed him as a special advisor in the National Archive. Perhaps a clever ploy to keep the man silent. During this period, he also met the Polish national poet Adam Mickiewicz, whose epic Pantadeusz I discussed a while back, who was also exiled to Russia due to his political activities in Poland, which was under the Russian rule at the time. In 1828, Pushkin met Natalia Goncharova, one of the most beautiful ladies in Russia, who was 16 at the time. 3 years later, they were married. Here's a twist of fate. Pushkin, throughout his bachelor life, seduced and slept with many women, often someone else's wife. Now he was married to a beauty. Guess what happened? Other young men pursued her, so Pushkin had to face the same fate he had inflicted on others. A Frenchman pursued Natalia, and Pushkin challenged him to a duel in which he was wounded. 2 days later, in 1837, Pushkin died aged 37. This image of Pushkin is carved into the Russian psyche. The young poet was dead, his beautiful wife a widow, and Russia was without its greatest writer. Now I'll summarize Pushkin's masterpiece, Eugen Onegin, which bizarrely has a duel in it which results in the death of a young poet. Did Pushkin predict his own death? Eugen Onegin, or Eugen Onegin, is a novel in verse published in 1837, which Pushkin wrote between 1825 and 1832, taking him almost 8 years. Pushkin wrote it in Onegin verse, which he developed and now named after the book. Its protagonist is Eugene, or Evgeny, the first and most important Russian character who's known as the superfluous man, someone who lives in his head, a bit sentimental, romantic, or someone who thinks a lot yet unable to enact on his ideas, or fails to achieve his life's goals. I have discussed this in great detail in my other videos, especially in the prose works of Turgenev and Dostoevsky. At the heart of the novel is this fundamental question: what is the purpose of life? Is it happiness? Is it achieving your goal, or is it a perpetual struggle? Is it passion in the form of love or death? The narrative focuses on 4 people, 2 men and 2 sisters, from the Russian high society, all educated and cultured. Eugene is a 26-year-old man who belongs to St. Petersburg's high society, whose enormous wealth and good looks put him at the top of Russian society, so he looks down on most people. But you know, when you have it all, you experience it all, now it's harder to get fulfillment from things in life. Since he has seen or experienced plenty of parties and a glamorous life, he gets bored very easily. He questions life. What is the point of it all? He's a cynical man, the opposite of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Prince Myshkin, who's naive and innocent. I think Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot in response to Eugen Onegin to depict blind faith or Don Quixote type character. Eugene is a Hamlet-type character who questions everything. Sick of the city life, Eugene decides to move to the country state that his uncle has left him. There he meets a young and naive poet, Vladimir Lensky from a neighboring state, who daydreams about his romantic fantasies. The young poet, Vladimir, incidentally educated in Germany, where he must have read Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, published in 1774, some 25 years before Pushkin was born, the most romantic works of German literature. Vladimir is engaged to be married to Olga, a bubbly and happy-go-lucky kind of girl who doesn't think very deeply. But she has a sister, Tatiana, who's the opposite, very quiet, thoughtful, yet deeply romantic and passionate on the inside. Vladimir invites Eugene to meet his fiancée, Olga, and her sister, Tatiana. Now we have all four of them together in the house, 2 boys and 2 girls. Vladimir and his fiancée's older sister, Tatiana, are romantic and passionate people, while Eugene and Olga are less romantic. You know what happens. The quiet Tatiana falls in love with the city boy Eugene, but she is too shy to talk to him directly, so she gathers all her courage to write a love letter confessing her romantic feelings for the St. Petersburg man. It's an incredibly beautiful moment. As she dreads writing the letter, here's what she says. To see you by our fireside stand, to listen to the words you speak, address to you one single phrase, and then to meditate for days of one thing till again we met. Why did you visit our poor place, forgotten in the village lone? I never should have seen your face. Imagine, here alone am I, no one my anguish comprehends. At times my reason almost bends, and silently I here must die. But I wait thee, scarce alive, my heart with but one look revive. Or to disturb my dreams approach, alas, with merited reproach. When she finishes her letter, she says, "'Tis finished, horrible to read, with shame I shudder and with dread." Eugene has seen plenty, so he's not swayed by a country girl's romantic confession. So he ignores her letter. Here Pushkin masterfully contrasts the cynical man's reaction to something so incredibly tender by a young woman. His self-righteousness is summed up in a saying which has become a very popular proverb in Russian, "Moy dadya samich chestnych pravil," which basically means my uncle knows it all, or my uncle is a self-righteous man. Tatiana is heartbroken. She tries to get an answer, but Eugene keeps pushing her away as if she is a naive country girl. But as time passes, she gathers her courage and talks to him directly. This is another tender moment. Tatiana is trembling with fear and nervousness as she tells him, oh boy, how naive she is. Not only Eugene rejects her, he also adds salt to the injury by giving her a famous speech, as is known Onegin's sermon, in which he tells Tatiana that her love is cute but no thank you, resolutely saying that he is not interested in love or marriage. Eugene doesn't stop there. He also advises Tatiana to forget her romantic fantasies and naivety, and that she should live in reality. He tells her that if she continues to fall in love with men, someone might take advantage of her blind passion to destroy her. The age of rationality has arrived in Russia. There's a Russian saying, "Lubov zla, polubish i kozla," which means love is evil, it will make you fall in love with a goat, in other words, a playboy. Meanwhile, Vladimir still hopes to see Eugene and Tatiana together, so he prepares a party and invites the city boy. A few days before the party, Tatiana has a nightmare in which she is chased by a bear, symbolizing the cold of rationality, I guess. So she takes refuge in a country hut where Eugene has a party, only to find it's full of goblins and demons. Eugene comes to her rescue only to stab Vladimir with a knife. Tatiana wakes up terrified. This is a bad premonition. Now, in real life, Vladimir tells Eugene that the party is small, only a family gathering. But when Eugene shows up, he realizes it's a mediocre country ball. Eugene has seen so many great parties and balls, much more grander in his own hometown, St. Petersburg, that this little party means absolutely nothing to him. Vladimir's sneaky plan annoys him. Eugene gets more annoyed with the country people who gossip about him and Tatiana. Eugene decides to teach Vladimir, the young country boy, a lesson. Here, Pushkin contrasts the sincerity of the country people with the cynicism of city man who looks down on these beautiful country souls. Eugene, instead of finding the people more endearing, is too absorbed in his own vanity and embarrassment. Not only that, Eugene goes further in stabbing his friend behind his back and also to teach the man a lesson by seducing Vladimir's fiancée, Olga, who turns out to be incredibly easy as she is totally gullible while dancing with the sophisticated man of St. Petersburg. Since we are in 19th century Russia, Vladimir challenges his friend Eugene to a duel. At first, Eugene laughs at this. A country boy? But he has to accept because his pride is on the line. It turns out to be an easy job. Eugene shoots and kills the young poet. Years later, Pushkin himself, a young poet, is the victim of the same fate, a duel in which he dies. Perhaps somewhere in his own subconscious he saw that coming. But for Eugene, the experience is transformative. He is a different man from the Eugene before the duel. As we saw in Turgenev's Father and Sons too, when Bazarov injures his enemy in a duel, his whole nihilistic ideology crumbles. By killing his friend, Eugene kills his own old self or past self. Eugene decides to destruct himself by leaving not only the country state, but also leaving Mother Russia to travel abroad. In his absence, Tatiana, who sees him as an enigma, visits Eugene's house to understand the mysterious cold-blooded man who rejected her love. Inside the house, she finds plenty of books which Eugene had left behind, with plenty of notes. She reads them carefully and realizes that Eugene is in fact an amalgamation of his literary heroes, just like Don Quixote, whose reading transformed him into an insane knight. She realized that Eugene is not a real person, but someone transformed through his own readings that have filled his head. He's nothing but a misanthrope whose head is filled with little impressions he read in books. In other words, Eugene is like a walking bookshelf that contains everything from the ancient world to the modern. A bogeyman or a tragic joke who is nothing but made of little dust of whims and impressions of other writers. In other words, he's no solid core, a fake, an imitation. I have to be honest, it did make me a bit self-conscious because I have read a lot of books and sometimes I do feel I've lost myself. So Pushkin was right. You are the sum of those people around you if you have friends, or the sum of all the books you've read if you don't have any friends, which is true in my case. Here Pushkin also takes a swipe at the pretentious city people who are fake in everything they do. But he's also critical of himself, as Eugene is somewhat similar to himself, a learned man who ruined people's marriages and never stopped seducing other men's wives. Not only that, Tatiana doubts her own love. Perhaps she doesn't love the real Eugene, but the persona of someone shaped by all the books he's read. As Proust said, when we fall in love with someone, we fall in love with that person as imagined by us, not the real physical person, but how they are represented in our imagination. And that's why we fall out of love once we understand them more. Now the first part is over. Eugene rejects Tatiana. Not only that, he also kills her brother-in-law Vladimir, leaving Tatiana's sister Olga without a husband. Now in part 2, Pushkin reverses it all. It's time to take revenge on Eugene, the cruel city boy. Time passes, days turn into months and then years. Now we're back in St. Petersburg in the most lavish ball in Russia, where men with the biggest balls are attending the biggest ball. Eugene notices a fairy-like lady dancing in the pool of everyone's attention. Who could it be? Eugene is curious. It is of course the country girl he rejected years ago. Has she risen the ranks to take revenge? Perhaps. It is of course Tatiana, who is now married to a prominent Russian prince and a big-shot army general. As the saying goes, you only want things you cannot have. Eugene's obsession with Tatiana starts to grow bigger and bigger. Now the table has turned. It's Tatiana who pushes Eugene away. Eugene sends her love letters and she ignores. He chases her and she tells him no, but no thank you, by showing her ring. I'm married. The more she says no, the more he wants her. Eugene tells her, let's run away, somewhere nobody knows us. She thinks for 2 seconds and says, nah. Eugene's persistence finally has a result, but it's not what he wants. Tatiana says she loved him, but there's that famous dreadful but in all romantic tales. She says that ship has sailed because she is married to another man. Now here Tatiana does the same as Eugene did all those years ago. Quote, Onegin, I was younger then, and better if I judge aright. I loved you. What did I obtain? Affection, how did you requite? But with austerity for you, no novelty, is it not true? Was the meek love a maiden feels? But now my very blood congeals, calling to mind your icy look and sermon. But in that dread hour, I blame not your behavior, an honorable course you took, displayed a noble gratitude, my soul is filled with gratitude. It was possible then happiness, nay near, but destiny decreed. My lot is fixed with thoughtlessness. It may be that I did proceed. With bitter tears my mother prayed, and for Tatiana mournful maid. Indifferent was her future fate. I married, now I supplicate. Forever your Tatiana leave. Your heart possesses, I know well, honor and pride inflexible. I love you, to what end deceive? But I am now another's bride. Forever faithful will abide. She rose, departed, but Eugene stood as if struck by lightning fire. What a storm of emotions keen raged round him and of bold desire. And hark, the clang of spurs is heard, and Tatiana's husband soon appeared. She gives him a sermon, a speech in which she tells him that she has no desire to break her promise to her husband. The rational, sensible speech Eugene gave years ago now bites him in the ears. She tells him he better forget it all. Russian women stay loyal. More importantly, country women stay loyal. She walks away, leaving Eugene to ponder over his life choices. He failed in his only romantic pursuit to make him officially the first Russian superfluous man, whose ideas in his head interfere with his quest, either romantic or ideological. Later Russian superfluous men would fail in their love, but also fail in their ideological missions, until Vladimir Lenin finally breaks that spell in 1917 to turn Russia into a socialist state. Analysis. Fiction in real life. Don Quixote by Cervantes and Madame Bovary by Flaubert and Eugen Onegin by Pushkin all have one element in common. What you read impacts you in ways you don't even realize. Writers throughout the world have understood that reading shapes your personality, outlook, and even your life's decisions. Eugene was a product of his world, which also includes in the literary world. He read a lot of romantic narratives, admired many heroes, and tried to live his life just like them. I think Pushkin shows that our ideas about love, life, happiness, and success can sometimes lead us astray. Eugene thought that he knew better when he rejected Tatiana, but later, as time passed, he understood how much he had miscalculated her. By the time he realizes his mistake, it is of course too late. And that makes this a masterpiece. Now the biggest irony of all Pushkin is his own life. He was killed in a duel just like Vladimir was. Why? Because he pursued and slept with many married women. But finally, it was another man who pursued Pushkin's own wife who killed him. So what goes round comes around. City versus country. One of the central themes in Pushkin's Eugen Onegin is whether smart and learned people lose out in the long run. Eugene is a rationally smart man who rejects human nature and passion by rationally analyzing it as idiotic. He rejects Tatiana's love as something stupid. In other words, Pushkin tells us Eugene has seen plenty, which means he is like a damaged good. His learning has made him to misjudge things. His prejudice blinds him to his natural instinct. And city life has damaged his natural intuition. In other words, once seen, it cannot be unseen. Knowing too much makes one to be cynical and never happy. Tatiana, however, embraces her nature, her passion, and her honesty in living within her natural inclinations. Her naive love makes her unhappy, but for Pushkin that is more admirable because she embraces her natural intuition. We are meant to suffer in life. There is no way you can avoid it. So you might as well suffer while being true to your nature, authentic, and brave in embracing your natural passion. Eugene thinks by being smart he wouldn't suffer, but at the end he is miserable because he fought against his natural passion in favor of reason. Tatiana doesn't fight her natural romantic inclination, while Eugene's learning and urban experiences have made him smart in the head, but an idiot in the heart. He's a superfluous man who lives an inauthentic existence, mostly in his head, while ignoring those around him as well as his own natural instincts. This makes you unhappy, bitter, and cynical. Dostoevsky in all his novels try to show that knowing too much, seeing too much, and questioning too much make you miserable in the long run. Tatiana is a symbol of country people who remain sincere, passionate, loyal, no matter what is thrown at her. Eugene's superficiality means he gets bored very quickly because he's not fulfilled on the inside. I think Pushkin tries to show that outside comfort is never enough. You want more and more. Inner comfort is important. Onegin's rational speech about romantic passion is cold and cruel. His duel with Vladimir also exposes the societal conventions of the time dictating his life. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that man is born free but tainted by society. Pushkin takes it even further, saying that not only society but what you also read or consume that come from outside your own culture. Eugene values his romantic heroes, Byron in particular. His cynical views of others make him selfish and indifferent to others. Pushkin contrasts the warmth of the country with the cold of the city. However, Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov and Ivan, both influenced by outside ideas coming from the West, question Russian Orthodox values and tradition. So this takes a more nationalistic tone. Russia was modernizing it, so people were attracted to shiny things coming from Western Europe. This was making people more selfish, superficial, and insincere. Pushkin and later Dostoevsky showed the negative side of modernity, making people more empty and fake. Suffering. There is no Russian novel in which suffering is not a central theme. According to Dostoevsky, Pushkin's poetry shows that the Russian people do not look for happiness, but instead they look for struggle. Russian literature is not an escape from reality, but taking us deeper into reality, digging deeper into inner psyche of our existentialist suffering. The harsh, cold, and inhospitable climate requires people to be real, to embrace reality, no matter how horrible or unpleasant. When your survival is at stake, it's important to know the bitter truth than sweet lies. Eugen Onegin is a tale of struggle. How do you find love? When do you say yes to love? And when do you say no to love? And most importantly, how to live with the consequence of your decision, good or bad. Russians don't seek happiness, but struggle. Pushkin's spell on Russian. Pushkin poetry captured the imagination of generations of Russian readers for the simple reason that his language is incredibly simple, which is only possible if you have clarity of mind. Another important fact to know is that he was educated in French, so his Russian was not as refined as his French in his early years. But this allowed him to write in a kind of bare-bone Russian, raw, honest, and precise. Not some fluffy, jumbled literary language, but simple. His outsider's approach helped him remove the fluffy and sentimental aspects of the language, make it as bare-bone as possible. Pushkin was not a nice man in that he pursued many married women, but never committed to them. He was a playboy prince who couldn't have enough of women. But he lived an authentic life. His noble social status allowed him to be true to himself. This authenticity gave him a clear voice to express his inner passion and feelings as simple as possible. Just remember that being part of the aristocracy meant that there was a huge amount of pressure on him to tone things down or contain what he wrote. But he ignored the outside world and instead trusted his gut feelings and inner voice to tell the truth, to express his inner poetry with clarity and precision. I've talked about honesty being one of the most defining features of Russian literature, and it all begins with Pushkin. He never shied away from being incredibly self-critical in those around him. He turned his observation about himself and the world into beautiful poems. Another reason he has remained immortal is that he captures one of the biggest contradictions of human existence. We all seek happiness, we all seek peace, yet at the same time we cannot avoid conflict on the outside, but also on the inside. Pushkin understood that on the surface we all want peace and happiness. But if you peel back layers and get to the bottom of human existence, we seek discomfort, chaos, anguish, and conflict. He tapped into his inner voice to articulate this existential contradiction between comfort and discomfort, between love and loss, between peace and conflict, between beauty and sadness. We humans need both. We humans love rules but also unruliness. It was Dostoevsky said that Pushkin captures that Russian people desire not for happiness but struggle. I think we want happiness but also deep down crave for some struggle. Human life is a contradiction, and Pushkin's Eugen Onegin is a great example of that contradiction. Now, I'll read Pushkin's most famous poem titled 2 ****, translated by Andrei Neller, which almost all Russians can recite. It was written in 1825 when he was exiled to the country state where he spent time in solitude. It is believed that Pushkin wrote it about his love, Anna Kern, or some other woman. I still recall the wondrous moment when you appeared before my sight. as though a brief and fleeting omen, pure phantom in enchanting light. In sorrow when I felt unwell, caught in the bustle in a daze, I fell under your voice's spell and dreamt the features of your face. Years passed and gales had dispelled my former hopes, and in those days I lost your voice's sacred spell, the holy features of your face. Detained in darkness, isolation, my days began to drag and strive. Without faith and inspiration, without tears and love and life, my soul attained its waking moment. You reappeared before my sight, as though a brief and fleeting omen. Pure phantom in enchanting light, and now my heart with fascination beats rapidly and finds revived, devout faith and inspiration, and tender tears and love and life. In 1837, the Russian literary world woke up to a shocking event. Alexander Pushkin was killed in a duel, aged 37. Then, as people were wiping their tears, a young man wrote a poem titled The Death of a Poet. This poem captured everyone's imagination, but also announced the arrival of a new poet in Russia. This 22-year-old man was Mikhail Lermontov, today the most important poet in Russia after Pushkin. But 4 years later, he himself died in a duel, aged 26. Despite his short life, he made a huge ripple in Russian literature. He wrote a single novel. Not only it's the first in prose, it's also the most loved novel in Russia. So today I'll tell you all about Lermontov's masterpiece, A Hero of Our Time, which is perhaps the best study of male psychology and the paradox of masculinity. It asks the fundamental question why life is so contradictory. And then I'll also read one of Lermontov's most famous poems. Lermontov was also a great artist. Throughout this video, I'll be using his paintings as visuals. But first, let me tell you about the writer himself. Mikhail Lermontov was born in 1814 into a noble family that traces his origin in Scotland. Pushkin's great-grandfather was born in sub-Saharan Africa, but kidnapped by the Turks and gifted to the Russian Tsar. In a similar twist, Mikhail Lermontov's distant relative was a Scottish soldier, George Lermontov, in the service of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Army, who was captured by the Russian army, and then he settled in Russia and was given the title of nobility. So the name Lermontov has a Scottish origin. Lermontov's mother died when he was young, so he was raised by his grandmother, who employed tutors from abroad in Russia to educate the young man. At different times he had French, German and English tutors, so Lermontov read the romantic poetry of Schiller, Goethe and Lord Byron as a young boy, which had a profound influence on his own life as well as writing. Lermontov was a sickly child, so he remained home a lot of the time. Due to ill health, he was taken to the Caucasus several times for a better climate and better water. This also had a huge influence on him, which became the setting of his masterpiece and also the setting of his own demise. Lermontov had limited contact with his father, and as a result he grew up to be withdrawn and aloof, which is reflected in this novel. And his ill health didn't help either. When he was 14, he was taken to Moscow to enter high school as part of Moscow University for the Kids of High Society, where he became the editor of school journal and wrote many poems. In 1830, he entered Moscow University to study philology. His arrogance, cruel, and narcissistic tendencies became known. At one point, he joined a group of student mobs who kicked out a professor known as the Malov scandal of 1831. Around this time, the death of his father had a deep impact on the young man, almost drove him to suicide. His studies were seriously compromised, so he left after 2 years at university. In 1832, he moved to St. Petersburg, but failed to join university there, so instead he enrolled in a military academy where he met a man who would kill the poet a few years later. The tough life of an army student further pushed him towards sharp wit and cruel tendencies. Later, he would write in his masterpiece, quote, "The first experience of torture gives an understanding of the pleasure in tormenting others." His rich grandmother was footing his bills, therefore he immersed himself in hedonistic life, womanizing, drinking, but also writing sharp poetry. In 1837, Russia woke up to hear the shocking news of Pushkin's death. Lermontov spent a few minutes writing a poem called The Death of a Poet that propelled him to an unprecedented fame. It was like Russia Got Talent. But this fame brought the attention of the government to his other poems, which were pretty radical and revolutionary, so he was arrested and exiled to the Caucasus, where he had spent great time as a child. This was a perfect holiday for the young poet to focus on writing his masterpiece, A Hero of Our Time, in 1838. He returned to St. Petersburg and then Moscow for a while. But in 1841, he returned to the Caucasus and settled in the picturesque town of Pyatigorsk, in Russian means 5 mountains. Here, his school friend was also there, so they had a disagreement which resulted in a duel, and Lermontov was killed in 1841. He was 26 years old. In an ironic twist, Lermontov's novel has a duel too. Here he tells us about his supporting character, somewhat similar to his friendly enemy who would kill him at the end. Quote, his goal is to be the hero of a novel. He has so often tried to convince people he is not of this world, but is doomed to some sort of secret torture that's almost convinced himself of it. This is why he so proudly wears his heavy soldier's greatcoat. I've seen through him, and for this he doesn't like me, even though on the exterior we have the most friendly of relationships. Grushinsky has a reputation for being an excellent brave. I've seen him in action. He waves his saber, cries out, and throws himself forward with his screwed-up eyes. This is something other than Russian courage. Pushkin and Lermontov, 2 greats of Russian literature, died in duels. We might think of it as stupidity, but Lermontov wrote in his novel, quote, I'm always braver going forward when I don't know what to expect. After all, nothing can happen that is worse than death, and you can't avoid death. His death at such a young age further cemented his place in the canon of Russian literature. He left a great many poems and books behind, but people outside Russia know and love him for his only novel. Now I'll discuss his masterpiece, A Hero of Our Time, the first Russian novel in prose. Summary. Герой нашего времени, or A Hero of Our Time, was published in 1840 when Lermontov was 25 years old, which is astonishing. But not in this case, because a year later he was dead. Also, it's a very short novel compared to the future Russian novels. It's a collection of 5 interconnected stories with many extremely developed characters, but mainly about one man, Pechorin, and his sexual romantic adventures told through third-person narrative as well as first-person diary of the man himself. The first story, Bella, is told by Pechorin's friend Maxim Maximich about a Cherkessian woman called Bella, whom Pechorin falls in love with. The second story, Maxim Maximich, is about sympathetic man himself as he travels through the region with Pechorin. The third story, Taman, tells Pechorin's encounter with an outlaw smuggler called Yanko on the shore of the Black Sea. The fourth story, Princess Mary, is about Pechorin's seduction of a princess. The final story, Fatalist, sums up Pechorin's life philosophy and contradictions. The setting is the Caucasus, mainly in and around town of Pyatigorsk, where Lermontov himself died in a duel at the foot of Mount Mashuk, which appears prominently in the novel. Pechorin, the main character or the anti-hero, is a young army officer who travels in the Caucasus. This mirrors a lot of Lermontov's own life. He too was an officer in the army, went to all those places mentioned in the novel. Pushkin's anti-hero protagonist, Eugene, was a man like a rock who melted at the end, but Lermontov's hero Pechorin is a rock throughout, unpleasant at times but a man who never bends. Quote, I confess that I have a strong prejudice against the blind, the cross-eyed, the dead, the mute, the legless, the armless, the hunchbacked, and the like. I have noticed that there is always a sort of strange relationship between the exterior of a person and his soul. It is as if, with the loss of a feature, the soul loses some kind of sensibility. A few things to know about Pechorin. He is considered a recurrent Russian superfluous man. He is a typical Byronic hero who is a bag of contradictions. He is sensitive, romantic, but also hard rock. He is arrogant, but also self-deprecating, who questions the meaning of life and death. His name comes from the river Pechora in the north of Russian Republic of Komi. Just like Pushkin's hero, Onegin is named after Onega River, also in the north of Russia. Lermontov's Pechorin achieves what Pushkin's Onegin failed. He gets women, he's successful, but he's also extremely unhappy and never content. Just like a river that has shallow parts and deep areas, at times Pechorin's deep thinker who knows his own self on an extraordinary level, but also a man of action who travels through the region meeting all kinds of people from bandits, officers, ordinary people, blind and aristocrats. Lord Byron was a huge influence on Pushkin and Lermontov. Lermontov in particular because he knew his Scottish or British ancestry. At the same time, Pechorin's thoughts are incredibly deep and they get into the heads of the readers, making us think on an eternal questions of human existence. Pechorin's philosophy in life is quite simple. A man's life purpose is to go out to conquer and slay the dragons. When he comes back, he gets the woman to procreate with. In other words, women would not even entertain a man who has not done something in life. A man just by mere existence is not enough. He has to do something, achieve something, conquer something. Just as mentioned in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, women seek men with passion. For Pechorin, women are spoils of war. The winner takes them all, so to speak. Life is a mere game of chess for him. Some win, some lose. Thinking so, Pechorin sees romantic pursuits futile because women are always drawn to the men who conquer, not the men who pursue them. He believes women are naturally drawn to the conqueror and the powerful. That's one reason men historically became soldiers and fought in wars. Today, men become athletes to achieve the same goal. Quote, "There's nothing more paradoxical than the female mind. It's difficult to convince a woman of anything. They have to be led into convincing themselves. The order of the proofs by which they demolish their prejudices is most original. To learn their dialectic is necessary to overthrow in your own mind every scholastic rule of logic." However, his cynical understanding of woman's intention is questioned by one woman. He is unaware that his own free will is determined by his emotions and passion. Early in life, Pechorin is with a woman called Bella, a Muslim Circassian woman who was abducted by another man and brought to him. After a lot of persistence, manipulation, and even learning her language and convincing her through religion, Pechorin finally managed to sleep with her. But as time passes, he gets bored of her. He wants to be free from her. His spirit is restless and he wants to move to another place or another woman. But when Bella is injured during a kidnapping, Pechorin does everything to be with her. Unfortunately, she dies, and this brings a huge heartbreak for Pechorin to an extent that he becomes seriously ill and very weak. However, on the outside, he acts stoic among the other people to show his masculinity. Pechorin uses every Machiavellian tactics to get women. Once he gets the woman, he discards her. In other words, he likes the chase but not the prize. In pursuing Princess Mary, instead of praising her or falling to her feet, he does everything to annoy her, while his rival Grushnitsky worships her. Here, Lermontov juxtaposes a nice guy with a bad boy. Grushnitsky is a typical nice man who shows affection. But Pechorin is the opposite. He believes that women love distant or emotionally unavailable men, because nice, attainable men are boring, therefore not respected by women. In Jane Austen's novel, at the beginning men are arrogant and not nice, which makes a huge impression on the female characters. It's a well-known phenomenon that young women's natural instinct is to go with the bad boy or the so-called toxic men to try to tame them, perhaps because it's a hardwired natural instinct, as these men don't care about anyone or anything, which paradoxically makes them more attractive. Beauty and the Beast is a good example. Young women want to tame a beast. I guess that's same with men. An easy woman is never prized, but a married woman is always chased in literature because it's stealing someone else's wife. Almost like a pirate stealing other people's treasure. Pechorin's other obsession is Vera, a married woman whom he obsesses over. Pechorin succeeds in getting Princess Mary's love through his own warm and cold approach. But he is challenged to a duel which he wins by killing his friend and rival, Grushnitsky. But once he is done, he tells Princess Mary that he doesn't love her. It was just a game. Vera, a married woman, too loves Pechorin despite his flaws. There seems to be a genuine feeling between the two. She's perhaps the only woman who can save him, his faith in romantic relationship, or tame the beast. But Lermontov throws a spanner in the works. At a crucial moment when Pechorin is following Vera, his horse collapses and he thinks there is no point in pursuing her further. What is the point anyway? Because soon he will get bored of her as well. He questions his own purpose in life. He's conflicted about his own masculine role in society. This emptiness leads him to quick pleasures in life and ends up completely in turmoil. His biggest contradiction is between rationality and irrationality, reason and passion. He thinks sensibly but then acts impulsively. The issue of rationality versus passion was later developed much more by Dostoevsky, who said that humans are not as rational as we are expected to be. So Pechorin is a pioneer of Russian heroes whose thought process and actions do not match. They think one way and act in a different way. I think we can all relate to this. Modernity, through the education system and other social institutions, drill in us that we are meant to be rational and sensible all the time. But on a day-to-day basis, we engage in so many irrational acts, from drinking, eating too much, to lazing about, or even masturbating, and many more impulsive acts. I'm not saying those acts are not good, but if you think about it, they're not very rational, but rather natural or impulsive. Pechorin's only explanation for this contradiction is that he is a man. In other words, his fate is a man to live in contradictions. Quote, "I've played the role of an axe in the hands of fate. Like an instrument of execution, I fell on the head of doomed martyrs, often without malice, always without regret. My love never brought anyone happiness because I never sacrificed anything for those I loved. I loved for myself, for my personal pleasure. I was simply satisfying a strange need of the heart, with greediness swelling their feelings, their joys, their suffering, and was never sated." In other words, his cruel actions, despite seeming intentional or selfish, stem from his nature as a male of his species. His sexual urge or libido has such a powerful spell on him that he has no control over his actions. His penis makes decisions for him. His self-analysis goes even deeper as he reflects on life's endless contradictions. Quote, "I was lying, but I wanted to infuriate him. I have a congenital desire to contradict. My whole life is merely a chain of sad and unsuccessful contradictions to the heart and mind. When faced with enthusiasm, I am seized by the midwinter freeze, and I suppose that frequent dealings with the sluggish phlegmatic would have made me a passionate dreamer of me. A man without passion is not respected, but a man with passion is bound to be toxic. He's supposed to be soft and romantic, but also hard and stoic. He's meant to restrain himself yet defend his honor. He's meant to be strong yet vulnerable. That's why A Hero of Time is perhaps the best novel that captures what it means to be a man who is admonished by society as toxic, but praised for being stoic and strong in the face of danger. The masculine toxicity that motivates you to do desirable things like fight, protect, provide, and compete in the real world also seeps into other areas like relationships and romance where toxicity is undesirable. In other words, it's good to be toxically masculine on the outside at the battleground, fighting danger, but not good inside the house or in a civilized setting. Today we might consider Pechorin as a man who carries past traumas. I think Lermontov himself was a melancholic character, perhaps due to the death of his mother at a young age, and very little access to his father as his grandma didn't want him around. Pechorin believes in his problems are all to do with his fate as a man. In other words, it's written in stars that a man has to suffer in order to be a man. But he also suffers if he decides not to be a man. It's written in the genes, DNA. He pursues women, gets them, and then he pursues other women, and every time he has to find ways to entangle and disentangle himself. In the process, he hurts them and hurts himself. He cannot remain in one place. He has to keep moving. Towards the end of the novel, he heads to Persia, not because someone is waiting for him there, because he cannot remain in one place. His feet get itchy. Just like a river that stagnates and turns into a quagmire or swamp, Pechorin has to keep moving. He also tells his friend there's little chance of him returning. His prophecy comes true. Pechorin dies on his way back from Persia. Reading this reminded me of two other novels from world literature. The Japanese novel The Tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki, is a 1,000-year-old romance about a man who pursues an endless number of women but never finds fulfillment in life. Another novel is Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, in which the protagonist questions the purpose of love and social climbing. Ultimately, Lermontov sees Pechorin as a man sandwiched between the blue sky and mountain, yet in neither places he finds peace and happiness. The color light blue, representing boys or masculinity, is mentioned in the novel many times. Incidentally, there is no blue in Russian language. It's either dark or light blue. A Hero of Time is perhaps the first novel to tackle what being a man really means inside out. Pechorin writes in his diary, "I sometimes despise myself. Is that not why I despise others? I have become incapable of noble impulses. Lermontov uses other characters as narrators to talk about Pechorin, so they offer an outside look at the man. Then Lermontov points the microscope into the man himself through his diaries to dissect the inner turmoil of a man. He doesn't try to justify or sugarcoat anything, he genuinely tries to understand manhood and masculinity. This inner psychological technique was used by Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment to see inside the head of Raskolnikov, a murderer. I guess Pechorin lived during the time when the education system was at its infancy. Today, the modern education system is there to educate but also tame men from their natural tendencies. It makes for a more peaceful society when men are less masculine. It's no surprise that women outperform men in schools and universities in most developed countries. Not just women, modern education system has also helped physically smaller men. As a somewhat physically small man, I could not have been able to compete in the physical world against more masculine men. And thankfully, due to modernity and the education system, I am able to be productive in other ways. Lermontov's hero is an egotist, selfish man, but masculinity in general, despite its many flaws, allowed civilization to flourish. So a small man like myself can have a safe and peaceful and productive life. Analysis. A Hero of Time is a deeply psychological novel on what it means to be a man. In today's world, masculinity is seriously challenged in society as toxic and undesirable. As a result, millions of men feel a bit lost and confused. Pechorin articulates his inner contradictions. Quote, 1 minute, just to see her for one more minute, to bid farewell, to squeeze her hand. I prayed, I cursed, I wept, I laughed. No, nothing could express my troubled mind, my desperation. On the other hand, he is a man who wants to be masculine, stoic, and strong among his peers. But on the other hand, he is sensitive and vulnerable. This is a very common male struggle, which causes many men confusion about how to navigate society. Society tells you one thing, but your natural instinct is telling you another. In order to prove themselves in the world, men are supposed to be strong and competitive, but to make matters worse, men's physiological needs dictate them to pursue women. And women generally prefer stronger men. Also, biology has dealt men a rough card in which their goal is not to be monogamous and stay with one woman, but pursue endless number of them. However, social conventions dictate loyalty to one person. Pechorin's deep suffering is not only due to failed pursuits, but also due to his inability to leave a woman once he gets her. This makes him very cynical about his existence. Quote, everything on earth is nonsense, nature is a fool, fate is Turkey, and life is a kopek. Kopek is a small coin in Russian currency which means worthless. As I discussed in The Tale of Genji, a novel written by a woman 1,000 years ago about a playboy prince who betrays many women he has sex with, but he hardly ever does it out of spite or cruelty, but out of inner biological necessity, in search of something. Pechorin is such a man who inflicts pain because the masculine role dictates his decisions and motivations. Lermontov is an amazing painter of nature, in literal sense because he was a great painter, but also in words. In the novel, there are many amazing sentences that capture nature's beauty. For example, he says, how interesting to watch a single dewdrop quivering on a wide vine leaf and reflecting millions of rainbow rays. How greedily my gaze sought to penetrate the foggy distance. His observation is not only limited to nature, but also human passion. Quote, many calm rivers begin with a noisy waterfall, but not one of them jumps and froths until the very sea. In other words, a romantic adventure is like a river, starts off with a waterfall when you fall in love with someone, and ends in calm sea once you make love. Human nature and passion tend to be similar to other natural phenomena. Some of his lines are extremely beautiful and poetic in capturing social phenomena. For example, I didn't want to be intrigued to you, I continued, because there's too thick a crowd of admirers around you and I was afraid of disappearing in it. Lermontov's legacy. Lermontov remains a huge name in Russia today. Outside Russia, however, his poetry is difficult to translate, so his novel, A Hero of Time, is considered a masterpiece. His own life mirrored his fiction. His characters lived a precarious life, but so did the poet himself, a romantic poet and a Byronic hero. He says, without fools, the world would be very boring. Living on the edge is very Russian indeed, so Lermontov is perhaps the most Russian writer of all time. But his legacy goes beyond Russia. I think his understanding of the male struggle is perhaps one of the best in literature. He could articulate the masculine burden of performance on men. How biology has made us into a beast whose incessant desire for endless women bring us head to head against the plight of women and society, sandwiched between a rock and a hard place that pushes men towards mistakes and cruelty. Pechorin is an archetypal anti-hero hero who lives a genuine masculine experience and articulates it very well. He can neither live with women nor without them. Today, he might be classed as toxic, antisocial, egotistic, and misogynistic. His critical analysis of his own personality is refreshing and extremely honest. Quote, "There are two people within me, one who lives the full sense of the world and the other who reasons and judges him." I think we all have these contradictions within us, and Lermontov's genius to depict that so beautifully, masterfully at such a young age is remarkable. He says we always forgive people who we understand. Despite all Pechorin's flaws, we all understand him. Why? Because he's honest about himself and his many flaws. The man is unable to control himself. Who knows what we would have had Lermontov lived to be 30, 40, 50, or even 60. Russia has changed since Lermontov's time, but Russian culture is still quite masculine, where courage, bravery, and being out in the wild and risking it are all still respected and honored. The reason Lermontov's writing, especially his poetry, resonate with people is that he captures Russians' attitude towards life, which is a kind of indifference. He doesn't romanticize Russian life. In fact, in some of his poems, he's critical of Russia, but at the same time, it is what it is. One cannot disown his family or parents. Russia is the motherland, fatherland, or where Russians live and breathe. As a sickly man, Lermontov felt more at home in the Caucasus, close to the mountains, and away from the flatland of Russia proper. But his poetry articulated the essence of Russian life, precarious, natural, impulsive, and living in the moment. He shows disdain for the authority and finds solace among ordinary peasants, nature, and mountains. His poetry undulates between individual freedom and fate as a man, woman, sick, or healthy. Now, I'll read one of Lermontov's most famous poems called The Sail, translated by none other than Vladimir Nabokov, another great of Russian literature. I think this poem captures the human condition that you will never find the comfort you're seeking in life, which echoes Pushkin's philosophy that life is not about peace, but a struggle and living dangerously. Amid the blue haze of the ocean, a sail is passing, white and frail. What do you seek in a far country? What have you left at home, lone sail? The billows play, the breezes whistle, and rhythmically creaks the mast. Alas, you seek no happy future, nor do you flee a happy past. Below the mirrored azure brightens, above the golden rays increase, but you, wild rover, pray for tempests, as if in tempests there was peace. What do the greatest Chinese writer Lu Xun, the most famous Japanese writer Ryunosuke Akutagawa, the Czech genius Franz Kafka, and the American writer Flannery O'Connor, and the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky have all in common? The answer is Gogol. Not Google, Nikolai Gogol. He inspired a new literary style, satirical, grotesque, or dark, ironic comedy, with the most famous example being Kafkaesque. Not only that, the Ukraine-born Gogol is pioneer of Russian prose fiction, and without him it would be difficult to imagine Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, as they were all heavily influenced by his satirical writing. Today I'll answer the following questions. Who was Nikolai Gogol? What are some of his best works? I'll summarize his masterpiece, Dead Souls, and discuss his style of writing and why he was such a comic genius. In the end, I'll tell you about some of his great short stories. Also his influence on world literature, from Japan to China, from Russia to Europe. But first, let me tell you a bit about Gogol's life. Nikolai Gogol was born in 1809, the same year as Charles Darwin, Edgar Allan Poe, or 3 years before Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1912. At the time, Ukraine was as Malaya Rus, or Little Russia, like today Belarus means White Russia. Gogol was born in a Cossack family. For those of you who don't know, Cossacks were originally nomadic people who later lived in the territory of Russian Empire, or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but they also had a certain level of independence. The root of the word comes from the Turkic, which means free man. Later in Russia, the Cossacks took a more warrior connotation as they were organized in militaristic groups under the Soviet army. Gogol grew up speaking both Ukrainian and Russian, but he wrote his novels in Russian, the language of the empire at the time. Age 12, Gogol moved to Nizhin, a small town near Kiev, to study in secondary school. He hated his school curriculum, especially maths and science, but found his refuge in school theater, where his artistic and storytelling talent shined. Today, his former high school is a university called Nizhin Gogol State University. In 1828, when he was 20, he moved to St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, where people went in search of their Dickensian fortune. Gogol had two goals: one, to become a writer, and two, become a scholar of Cossack studies. Age 23, he published his first collection of short stories, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, mostly based on his childhood in Ukraine, described with care and attention. This book grabbed many readers' attention, so he doubled down on it and published 3 more collections of short stories, which established him as a young talent from Ukraine, or Little Russia. This further reinforces Gogol's interest in his own Cossack heritage. This resulted in his novel Taras Bulba, published in 1835, about a Cossack father and his 2 sons who fight not against the Russians but against Poland to free West Ukraine, which was under the occupation of Polish rule. Their fight for independence has disastrous consequences for the Ukrainian Cossacks and tragic betrayals on the Polish side. Gogol's style in this novel is epic and heroic, which is very different from his realism in his later more pop works. Despite his writing career boxing him as a Ukrainian or Little Russian writer, Gogol's attempt to get a steady government job in the fields of Cossack cultural studies failed. In a bizarre twist, however, somewhat akin to the comedy of his fiction, he was appointed the professor of medieval history at the University of St. Petersburg. But Gogol had no qualification to teach medieval history. It's like if Oxford University appoints me as a professor of Ukrainian studies. Gogol, the professor, gave a few vague, botched, and comic-style lectures, but a year later, in 1835, he resigned from his post, pretending his toothache was making teaching impossible for him. These experiences with the government officials, St. Petersburg bureaucracy, and pretentious people absorbed in their ranks and reputations gave Gogol great goggles to observe the Russian state, local officials, and the Russian people. Just remember that he was an outsider who had moved in, so he experienced being on the inside, and now he was on the outside once again. This gave him a perfect lens to dissect the Russia of the time, understand the psychology of those with power and those without. He was the greatest absurdist comic genius of 19th century Russian Empire, just as Franz Kafka was an astute analyst of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 20th century. They saw darkness, absurdities, and humor most people couldn't see or didn't care to see. Around this time, he also got to know Russia's greatest poet, Alexander Pushkin, who had a transformative influence on Gogol's life and writing, especially in the development of his comic voice in fiction. Without being able to establish a career for himself in St. Petersburg, he moved abroad to France, but later mainly lived in Italy. Why not? Nowhere can you find better pizza, opera, and culture. His travels also allowed him to meet writers from other parts of Europe, for example, the national poet of Poland, Adam Mickiewicz, who wrote the Polish epic of Pan Tadeusz. In 1841, he published his masterpiece, Dead Souls, which helped Gogol to become the best Russian prose writer of his age. It is Gogol's reinterpretation of Dante's Divine Comedy set in the 19th century Russia. In 1848, he traveled to Jerusalem and became more and more interested in religious experience. Around this time, he also started to experience moments of insanity, which resulted in him burning a large portion of his novel, Dead Souls Part 2. His mental capacity deteriorated to the point that in 1852 he refused to eat for 9 days, which ultimately killed him. Pushkin died aged 37, Lermontov died aged 26, and Gogol died aged 42. He would be the last of the Russian great writers who died young. In 1931, the authorities demolished the monastery where Gogol was buried and discovered that he was lying face down, raising speculations that he might have been buried alive. Now that makes a great plot for one of his own stories. He never married nor had any children. It is possible the man died a virgin. Summary. Mrtvé duše, or Dead Souls, was published in 1842, but it's incomplete as it ends in mid-sentence because Gogol, in a bout of insanity, destroyed second part. Or perhaps he was inspired by Laurence Sterne, who also finished one of his novels in mid-sentence. Gogol is often characterized as a Russian Sterne in his comic style, but much darker, which not only reflects the centuries of growth of modernity, but also the Russian setting being much gloomier in general. Its protagonist is Pavel Chichikov, a middle-ranking aristocrat, but with a huge entrepreneurial ambition to get rich. Very rich and very quickly. He has an amazingly clever idea to achieve his goal, buying dead people. Nobody has thought of such an original idea. The title of the novel, Dead Souls, refers to dead serfs in Russia. Before 1861, nearly 30 million Russians lived under the system of serfdom, meaning 50% of all Russians at the time belonged to the landowners. So if you bought land, the serfs who worked on the land also came with the purchase, like the animals. Landowners were responsible for the serfs, for their health, well-being, just like farmers care about their livestock. Since the government census only happened once every few years, the tax the landowners had to pay was based on the previous census. This meant landowners had to pay tax for those serfs who had died since the last census. This discrepancy between the official number of serfs on the register and the real number of serfs who worked on land cost money to the landowners. They were taxed on an asset that no longer lived. So this is where our hero of Dead Souls, the mysterious Mr. Chichikov, shows up in a town in Russia. At the beginning, Gogol doesn't tell us who he is and for what purpose he buys dead people. Gogol describes the inn he's staying as full of cockroaches and its cushions as hard as cobblestones. So we know that Chichikov is not the aristocrat he claims to be. But Chichikov doesn't care about the terrible inn he's staying. He's more interested in two groups of people in town. The powerful officials, like the town's mayor, chief of police, and other big shots, and the second group being the large landowners who have a lot of serfs. He's not alone though. He has two servants with him who help him drive his horse carriage and care for him. He's well-dressed, speaks eloquently, and talks pleasantly about everyone. He's the perfect swindler. While staying in town, he takes day trips to the neighboring farms just like a door-to-door salesman. Gogol's landowners are some amazing characters, each very unique, some old men, some women, and others as clever as Chichikov. Gogol's technique is to create these unique and varying characters to battle-harden Chichikov, to confront him, to test his patience. This makes a great comedy when you pit a swindler against some robust country people who are no pushovers. Some are as crooks as Chichikov himself. The landowners invite him to their house, give him food and drinks, and treat him like some royalty. Once he has gained a level of rapport with them, he gets to business. I want to buy your dead serfs. What did you say? I want to buy your dead souls. The landowners look at his mysterious man more carefully. They rub their ears to make sure they are hearing him correctly. Once Chichikov makes sure they know what he's asking, the landowners are as baffled as we are. They have the same question we all do. Why? For what purpose? Chichikov has many answers, usually saying it doesn't concern them, or he is a philanthropist helping local landowners by unburdening them of their taxes. Or he says his plan is too delicate to discuss openly. To the landowners, it all sounds too good to be true. Not only they don't have to pay tax, but they also get money. When Chichikov asks the landowners to keep it all secret, some are too skeptical. Some ask for more money, thinking their dead serfs might have gone more in value because they are dead. And some reject him, terrified, thinking there is something missing. There's one who asks him to play cards or gamble on the deal, which almost gets him into trouble with the police. Since each landowner has unique characteristics widely different from one another, Chichikov has to invent and reinvent himself every time. Here is a scene in which the landowner rejects his serfs as dead, but living. Quote, "So," went on Chichikov, "if no obstacle stands in the way, we might as well proceed to the completion of this purchase." What? Of purchase of dead souls? Of dead souls? Oh dear no. Let's write them down as living ones, seeing that this is how they figure in the census returns. His journeys are not as easy as he had expected. He thought that these country landowners would be happy to unburden themselves of tax or would be simple country people, but he has his works cut out for him. Here we learn that some landowners are as ruthless as Chichikov despite living in somewhat idyllic countryside. So Gogol shows that feudalism was just as ruthless as new capitalism of Chichikov, and exploiting people, sucking the blood of the poor, and counting every penny. The landowners talk about their serfs as if someone talked about their livestock. Some lazy, some are thieves, and some are hard workers. And some are afflicted with diseases so they couldn't be saved. They count their serfs like a shepherd counts his sheep. Despite that, Chichikov manages to buy almost 400 dead serfs. That is a success, so he returns to town to register them legally. In town, rumors spread about Chichikov's purchases, so he acts like a celebrity millionaire or a wealthy prince, and the corrupt people in the government buys his story and everyone treats him with respect due to his sudden fortune. Appearance is reality. People speculate about him, and ladies gossip to find many great qualities in him. People's imagination does the work for him, as they try to invent exaggerated qualities about Chichikov. As Uncle Ben said, with great fame comes great many rumors and suspicious tales. You cannot make quick money without making a few problems for yourself. People ask questions. Quote, "On first speaking to the man, his ingratiating smile, his flaxen hair, and his blue eyes would lead one to say, 'What a pleasant, good-tempered fellow he seems.' Yet, during the next moment or two, one would feel inclined to say nothing at all, and during the third moment, only to say, 'The devil alone knows who he is.' In other words, nobody knows him. People have to fill their imagination with something. The biggest rumor that is circulating is that Chichikov has bought 400 serfs and they're all dead. In other words, he has nothing but a book with just 400 dead names in it. Gogol shows a picture of before the gossips and after the gossips, how moral outrage turns nasty all of a sudden. At one moment, the people revere him as the shiny prince, the biggest hero in town. The next moment, everyone turns against him, just like the autumn wind changes course quickly. Today, the media elevates actors and then slams them down to make a story. In the chaos that ensues, some people think Chichikov might be Napoleon, disguising himself as a Russian, or some outlaw. Some even accuse him of planning to run away with the governor's beautiful daughter. Chichikov's princely days are over, and he has to run away from town before everything catches up to him. Gogol reveals that Chichikov's secret plan was to accumulate enough dead serfs on paper so he could go to the bank in order to get a large loan and then with his big stash of cash vanish to Mexico. I mean, somewhere nice to enjoy life. Basically, Chichikov is a ruthless and shrewd capitalist entrepreneur whose plan is to scam his way to quick wealth. He is a fraud and a clever swindler. But for Gogol, it's a fantastic idea for comedy to expose how old and lazy the Russian serf system was. Nothing but a standing joke. It's no surprise that 20 years after the publication of this novel, the Russian serf system was abolished and 30 million serfs were freed. And also decades later, the Bolsheviks destroyed the Russian social fabric to install a socialist system based on collectivization, in which everyone worked for the government. Here we learn a bit more about our anti-hero hero. Chichikov, in his previous job as a government employee, was fired for corruption. If there's one thing present in all Gogol's stories, it is his disdain for the corrupt yet pompous government officials. Since Chichikov worked for the government, he knew how to get rich, which exposed the level of corruption among the government officials. Despite this mishap, Chichikov is not deterred. Just like Don Quixote, he dusts off his clothes, gets up on his horse, and starts his next adventure as if nothing has happened. Russia is a big country, so he moves to another part of the country to try again. This time he makes friends with a lazy landowner to gain access to other rich landowners. Again, Gogol uses Chichikov's door-to-door salesman's journeys as a device to depict many absurd and crazy characters and incidents. Finally, Chichikov's dream of owning an estate is realized when he purchases one by forging a document. Unfortunately, he is caught in mid-action. The FBI shows up, KGB, the Russian police, arrest him. But once again, the man is lucky. Just like a cat, he has 9 lives. Some kind soul helps him avoid jail once again. He flees the area once again, perhaps in search of another part of Russia to scam his way for quick wealth. The novel ends in mid-sentence when the man who arrests Chichikov gives a speech talking about how corrupt Russia has become. Quote, "As a Russian, as one bonded to you by kinship, by the common blood coursing through our veins, I now appeal to you. I appeal to those among you who have any understanding of the concept of nobility of thought. I invite you to recall the duty which stands before man at every stage of his life. I invite you to take a close look at your own duty and the obligations placed upon you by your service on this earth, because that is something of which we are already dimly aware, but which we can scarcely..." Gogol, in his usual comic style, stops here. We don't know whether Chichikov managed to scam more people around Russia, but we know for sure that he's a free man in Russia's large country. Today the world has many Chichikovs, scam artists, make millions and live lavish lifestyles. It is likely that Gogol, while living in Italy, met some of them either from Russia or from other parts of the world on the run from their home countries, enjoying pizza and opera in Rome. Analysis. Comedy. When you read Russian fiction, you might think they are so pessimistic and despairing about life. It is true that Russian literature is appealing precisely because of how pessimistic it is about life and human nature. What makes Nikolai Gogol's fiction so unique is his comedy. A while back I talked about Lawrence Stern's novel Tristram Shandy. Gogol's writing is similar in its humor about the absurdities and ironies of life, and Dead Soul Chichikov, despite failing over and over, keeps on the path he is going. Chichikov is very similar to Don Quixote in that they are persistent despite their failures. Of course, Don Quixote is altruistic in his pursuit, while Chichikov is very much selfish. There are so many funny moments in the novel. For example, when a landowner demands a higher price for his dead serfs, Chichikov asks, "Why would I buy dead serfs at a much higher price?" The landowner says, "I don't know why, you're the one buying." The novel is full of funny scenes and lines. For example, everyone to his taste, one loves the priest and another the priest's wife. Another scene, a landlady stumbles. "I really don't know," the old lady brought out hesitantly. "You see, I've never sold the dead before." Russian people. Chichikov's encounters with many landowners are also extremely funny. He thinks he is smart because he comes from the city, and second, he has worked in the government, thinking the country landowners are just a bunch of simpletons, easily convinced to sell their dead serfs. But much to his astonishment, they turn out to be extremely robust in their negotiation techniques and entrepreneurial spirit of making more money. They are as greedy as he is. At times, this sophisticated businessman finds himself lost. Quote, "A Russian peasant scratching the back of his head means many different things." One could say that Gogol is poking fun of Russians. I think being an outsider, he was able to see the corruption, peculiar ways, and the comedy of errors in the ordinary lives of the Russian people. Two character traits are common. A general skepticism among the Russians who don't believe a thing that comes from outside. At one point, they are having a meal and the landowner dismisses the German food. Quote, "You can coat a frog with sugar and I still won't stick it in my mouth. Nor will I touch oysters. I know what oysters remind me of. Take some mutton," he continued, turning to Chichikov. "Here we have the saddle of mutton with buckwheat. This isn't one of those fricassees which they see up in fashionable household, using mutton that has been lying around in the market for at least 4 days. All those concoctions were dreamed up by a pack of French and German doctors, and if you ask me, they should handle a lot of them, concocting that diet of theirs to cure people by starving them. Just because they have that wishy-washy German constitution, they imagine they can get the better of a Russian stomach. No, it's all wrong. It's all a lot of stuff and nonsense. It's all. Another character trait discussed is Russia itself. The land has a mysterious force over its people, just like gravity on us all on Earth. It's a force, not always welcome, but very difficult to untangle yourself from it. Quote, Russia, what is the incomprehensible, mysterious force that draws me to you? Why does your mournful song, carried along your whole length and breadth from sea to sea, each and re-echo incessantly in my ears? What is there in that song? What is it that calls and sobs and clutches at my heart? What are those sounds that caress me so poignantly, that goes straight to my soul and twine about my heart? Russia, what do you want from me? What is that mysterious hidden bond between us? Russians are the product of their natural environment that has a spell over them. Corruption is at the heart of the novel. Landowners complain about bribes they have to pay to get things done in the government. One man laments that the priests don't do anything about the corruption. This shows that this is an old world where the state is not seen as an authority for justice, but the church is. Gogol was criticized by many Russian nationalists at the time for poking fun at its government and civil service. However, those opposed to the system praised him for exposing the ills of Russia. Making money. Today, entrepreneurs have to study people, but in those days, they had to experience it. Making sales today is a skill taught in business schools, but Chekhov had to learn it the hard way. Making money is at the heart of Dead Souls. Gogol, in his usual style, takes things to an extreme, and the capitalism of buying dead people in order to make money, to tell a story that was true back then and it's even truer today. In fact, I would say today, in a way, we have accepted this business practice of deceiving people through advertising. Today, everyone who is financially successful has taken a leaf from Chekhov's book. A good equivalent today would be harvesting and selling data online. Of course, big companies harvest our data, which we voluntarily hand over, and they make good bucks selling it to the advertisers. Those still alive are somewhat protected by data privacy, but those who have died can be bought and sold freely, I suppose. I'm sure there's a Chekhov out there today scamming advertising agencies by selling them dead people's data that is no longer useful. If you're a writer, this makes a great funny short story about someone doing that very thing, selling useless data about dead souls to some big advertising agency. If you do end up writing it and it becomes a success, please send 10% of royalty my way. Gogol is also famous for writing about the irrational and the grotesque side of human condition. So now I'll discuss a few of his most famous short stories here to highlight those themes. In his short story, A Madman's Diary, published in 1835, a man who works in the service of the Russian government tries to seduce a woman, but fails miserably. A few pages later, he jumps to the year 2000, April 43rd, and tada, he's become the king of Spain. Later, the protagonist cries, asking his mother for help to rescue him from what appears to be torture by the authorities. This short story, which I discussed in a separate video, inspired one of the greatest Chinese writer, Le Xun, to write a Chinese version of A Madman's Diary, which today is considered one of the greatest pieces of Chinese literature. It is a twist of fate. Gogol himself went mad towards the end of his life. One of the biggest mysteries of great literature is how much great writers predict their own demise in their fiction, as if fiction opens a subconscious door to another realm where our life choices happen that lead us to a certain path. The irrational subconscious or unconscious determines a lot of what we call free choice in life. Our deeper motivations, which we are often not aware of, are hidden somewhere inside us. They only manifest themselves through the creation of art, painting, or a piece of fiction. Gogol's most famous play, The Government Inspector, published in 1836, is perhaps one of the funniest stories in Russian literature. A small town gets news that an undercover government inspector is visiting their town to investigate the local authority. At the same time, a stranger is staying at an inn in town. The mayor, thinking it might be him, invites him to his house, treats him like a king at the expense of everyone in town. The guest has no idea what's going on as he's given lots of money as a bribe, and the townspeople are outraged by the cost of maintaining this crazy guest. But this comedy of error has a wonderful ending when all is revealed that they have bribed the wrong guy, leaving the audience imagination to continue the play after the story is finished. Gogol shows the level of corruption among the government officials, a theme present in all his novels. Gogol exposes the dishonesty of those in power, but he also takes a preemptive swipe at those defending the Russian state and its local authorities. He quotes a famous Russian saying, "Ничего не закрала пенет кола рожа крива," or "Don't blame a mirror for your ugly face." In other words, don't blame a messenger, Nikolai Gogol, but blame those in charge of Russia. His 1842 short story, The Overcoat, called one of the finest short stories by Vladimir Nabokov, is about a man who is too poor to buy a new coat, and when he manages to scrape some money to buy one, it gets stolen in the dead of the night. The coat was so dear to him that he treated it like a pet or even a wife, or like a child clinging to it like a security blanket. They became inseparable. When it's stolen, he is devastated. Not only that, in the freezing cold of St. Petersburg, which is also a metaphor for the ruthlessness of the most westernized, capitalist-minded city in Russia, which also shows up in works by Tolstoy later, especially in Anna Karenina, the poor man dies of freezing cold soon after, and later becomes a ghost that haunts the city, stealing people's coats. This is considered the most influential short story in Russian literature in terms of its realistic portrayal of life to a crazy level of dramatic exaggeration. Today we are all attached to our smartphones. When we lose it, we cannot function anymore. Gogol's grotesque is most visible in his short story The Nose, published in 1836, which is another classic short story by Gogol in which a man finds a nose inside his bread and tries to throw it away in the river, but instead gets arrested by the police. The owner of the nose, an army major, wakes up one morning to realize he has lost his nose. He goes to report his missing nose to the police, but notices that his nose is walking on the street pretending to be someone else. He chases but loses sight of it. His attempt to report fails. He tries to place a newspaper ad, but the newspaper clerk thinks he's reporting a missing man called Mr. Nose. Finally, he's told placing an ad for something so ludicrous can harm the newspaper's reputation, as everyone might think this is a practical joke. The clerk, to console the man, offers him some snuff, a kind of tobacco to sniff on. But obviously the man has no nose to sniff with. When he finally gets reunited with his nose, he cannot attach it to his face. It's a typical nightmarish tale we call Kafkaesque today. When you read Nikolai Gogol's stories, you see Kafka's writing much more clearly, and it's very obvious that Kafka was immensely influenced by Gogol. Gogol's name derives from a bird, perhaps a duck or mallard, so his beak-like nose was one of his most unique and identifying physical features. In human evolution, our physical features and our nose especially show our genetic memory, so it provides a great identifying feature of a family, clan, or lineage. So one without a nose cannot be recognized by society, but a nose without a body is easily recognized according to Gogol's short story. Gogol shows how much we put weight on name, ranks, lineage, and people's physical features. Why? Because we are primarily visual creatures. A man's entire being can be reduced to his nose. A man's entire life can be judged based on one act. If good, he's a hero. If bad, a villain. Nose as a breathing tool has become a social status like a peacock's tail. Gogol's nose inspired one of the greatest Japanese writer, Ryunosuke Akutagawa, to write a short story titled The Nose. Unlike in Gogol's story, in Akutagawa's 1916 short story, the protagonist, priest, does everything to minimize his long nose because he doesn't want people's attention. Japanese are known for not seeking attention or not wanting to stand out in society. He tries Chinese medicine on it to shrink it by boiling in hot water, then stomping on it, but instead things go south and people notice and ridicule his nose even more, until again he wakes up one morning and everything is fine. Also important to note that nose was an important subject in Tristram Shandy by Laurence Sterne, which must have inspired Gogol. This short story shows the importance of a tiny part of our body on our life. A missing nose of an important person is as debilitating as if he has lost his penis. As a man with a tiny nose, don't get the wrong idea, I'm talking about nose. As a man with a tiny nose, I do wish I had a bigger nose so I could breathe much better. Gogol's legacy. It's no exaggeration to suggest that without Nikolai Gogol's writing, Russian literature would have been very different today. His dark comedy or absurdist style can be seen in Dostoevsky's fiction, most visibly in Notes from Underground. That edgy style that reveals the darker side of human existence started with Gogol. The depth of his observation of the ordinary lives of the Russian people can be seen in Turgenev's fiction, especially in contrasting the old versus the young, most importantly in the countryside. I think his outsider's perspective, being a Ukrainian moving to Russia, allowed him to see Russia and the Russian people with a certain clarity and honesty, which influenced Tolstoy's fiction for being more self-critical. His sharp, witty sentences or simple encounters also influenced Chekhov's short stories. Gogol's beak-like, sharp Ukrainian nose allowed him to sniff and observe the smelliest and fishiest parts of Russia and the Russian Empire. This honest and self-critical tradition became an integral part of Russian literature and continued with Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and more. And we love Russian literature because of its raw honesty, which Gogol pioneered, all thanks to the man's comic nose. Gogol's influence outside Russia is even greater. Franz Kafka's Kafkaesque should be called Gogolesque, because his protagonist in the nose wakes up one morning to find himself without a nose. Just like in Kafka's Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa wakes up as an insect. Interestingly, Gogol had a big influence on Chinese and Japanese literature. As I already mentioned, Lashun, considered the father of modern Chinese literature, and Akutagawa, one of the most famous Japanese writers, wrote their own version of Gogol's short stories, The Nose and Madman's Diary. For me, Gogol is one of the greatest comic geniuses of the world literature, a son of Ukraine who wrote in Russian. The comedy still exists in Ukraine, as the current president was a comedian who played a president on TV and then became a president himself. This sounds very much like one of Gogol's stories. He wrote about the absurdities of life, but one of his most enduring legacies is his sharp observation of those in power, from petty officials to the very top. They all act and behave in the same way. They pretend and lie. The only way to expose their pretentiousness is through comedy. If you were to ask who are the greatest heroes in literature, you can name many, like Homer's Odysseus, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Sherlock Holmes, and Frankenstein's monster. If you were to ask who's the funniest hero, again, it's easy to name a few like Don Quixote, Tristram Shandy, Gogol's Chichikov, and so on. But if you were to ask who is the laziest hero in literature, you will have a hard time to find one, because literature is about action, sacrifices, heroic deeds, not someone lazing in his bed all day. Well, today we have one of the most lethargic characters in literature who has turned laziness into an art form. He's not just lazy, he thinks being lazy is deeply philosophical and profoundly artistic. Oblomov by Ivan Goncharov, published in 1859, depicts Russia's ultimate superfluous man whose ultimate question in life is not to be or not to be, but to move or not to move, or more precisely, to get out of bed or not to get out of bed. He's not some Taoist monk who preaches inaction or lives with the flow, but he's a Russian aristocrat who sleeps all day, barely managing to move between his bed and his chair. Thinking hard work or thinking hard itself is overrated, so he leaves all the decisions and choices to someone else to make. But first, who is Ivan Goncharov? Born in 1812, only 20 days after the Battle of Borodino against Napoleon, Ivan Goncharov's father was a wealthy grain merchant in Ulyanovsk province, 700 kilometers east of Moscow. Like most of Russia's wealthy class, he went to a French boarding school. When he was 10, he went to Moscow to enter a commercial school. In 1830, he attended Moscow University to study literature and art. Like all other Russian writers, he was blown away by the poetry of Pushkin. In 1835, he moved to St. Petersburg and worked as a French translator, but also got to know a circle of literary figures. In 1847, he published his first novel, The Same Old Story, juxtaposing the country people's romantic outlook against the Western pragmatic city people. Does this remind you of a Pushkin story? Of course, in Eugen Onegin, Alexander Pushkin tackles the same theme. In other words, the warmth of the country people versus the cold of the city people, a theme common in other Russian novels like War and Peace, Fathers and Sons, and so on. In 1849, he published a short version of Oblomov, which was criticized by Russian traditionalists as it depicted Russians as lazy and Europeans or Germans as hard-working people. In 1850s, Goncharov traveled around the world, including the UK, Africa, even Japan, as well as within Russia. In 1855, ironically, he worked at the censor office in St. Petersburg, where he helped writers like Turgenev and Dostoevsky publish their work. Due to an illness in 1857, he traveled to Marienbad, modern-day Czech Republic, where he wrote Oblomov, his masterpiece, which was published in 1859. He later returned to his censor job and also became part of the government and grew more conservative in anti-nihilism. In 1869, he published his third novel, The Precipice, in which he challenges Russian nihilism and its anti-artistic sentiment. It's a little similar to Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, but criticizes nihilism from an artistic perspective. Some consider it his best work. Goncharov was a slow writer in the mold of Gustave Flaubert, publishing a novel every 10 years or so. He planned a fourth novel but never finished it. In 1891, he died, aged 79. He never married nor had any children. I blame Arthur Schopenhauer, inflicting so many writers and artists not to pass life's miseries on to another soul. Later in life, he had a huge falling out with Ivan Turgenev, accusing him of plagiarism, which some argue was due to his insanity. Ivan Goncharov, after reading Nikolai Gogol's satirical tales, especially Dead Souls, which I discussed here before, worked on Oblomov for nearly 20 years. Bits and pieces of it were published at different times, but his travels, work, and life in general interrupted his flow, which perhaps also inadvertently allowed him to distill his idea into a gem of a novel, one of the best of Russian literature. His travels around the world in particular allowed him to see other countries and peoples so he could judge Russia from a distance. The result of that 20-year writing and rewriting is one of the most original novels of all time. What is the story? Summary. The story is told through a third-person narrative and is about a young man, Ilya Ilyich Oblomov, a Russian aristocrat with a huge country state conveniently called Oblomovka that has a lot of land and serfs like many other Russian nobility at the time. With Russia being so big, Oblomov's country state is like 1,000 kilometers away from where he lives. Well, what's unique about the man is his new technique of managing his state from his bedroom. He's not sick or disabled, but he sees no point in leaving his bed, traveling for miles, because he can do everything from home and more specifically from his bed. He has taken laziness to a whole new level. Quote, with Oblomov, lying in bed was neither a necessity, as in the case of an invalid or a man who stands badly in need of sleep, nor an accident, as in the case of a man who is feeling worn out, nor a gratification in the case of a man who is purely lazy. Rather, it represented his normal condition. Whenever he was at home, and almost always he was at home, he would spend his time lying on his back. Remember, this is 19th century Russia, so there's no internet that you can turn your bedroom into an office. Oblomov would have thrived if he lived in the age of broadband. But in those days, men had to get out to do something. Russian culture at the time, and even today, championed hard physical strive. So Oblomov thinks going out in the field is just too old-fashioned. He gets the news that his country state is experiencing financial problems and needs urgent attention from the man. This is not good. But Oblomov is religious about his technique of never leaving his bed. So what does he do? Instead of going out there to resolve the problem or consulting an advisor, he consults his subconscious self. He falls asleep and dreams. His dream takes him to his childhood. Such a wonderful time it was. He was free to do whatever he wanted. He was never asked to do any work. He had zero responsibility. We have all been there. But what's more, he was coddled by his mother with lavish holidays and gifts. It's important to note that his father was not involved in his upbringing, so he was with his mother most of the time. In other words, he was lacking a disciplinarian character in his childhood. I think Goncharov himself lost his father at a young age when he was 7 years old. So he knew the importance of a father figure in a child's life. So he contrasts Oblomov with another child who has a strict father. Oblomov's school friend is a half-German boy called Andrei Stolz, who lives a miserable life because his parents, his German father in particular, are extremely strict with him. Stolz is a disciplined, diligent, and hard-working man. Goncharov is making a point here that the Russian elite was lazy and the Germans were efficient and hard-working. Even today we have the same stereotype about Germans' efficiency. Oblomov's half-German friend Stolz comes to wake the lazy man up from his wonderful dream about his childhood. But he cannot convince him to get out of bed. Oblomov is stuck in his ways. But there's one tried and tested technique to make a man get out of bed and work hard. Introduce a woman in the mix. Andrei Stolz brings Olga, a young beautiful woman, to rouse a deeper motivation inside Oblomov. At first, Oblomov doesn't know what to make of her, and she too is intrigued by a man in bed all day. What's wrong with him? Is he disabled? But slowly the two get to know each other a bit more, and we all know what happens next. They fall in love. A man would do anything for a woman he truly loves. We are romantic animals after all. A man can conquer the moon for a woman he loves. It's time for celebration and some champagne or vodka. We can save Oblomovka instead and maybe Russia too. But unfortunately, this celebration was a little too premature. Oblomov is not just lazy, he's deeply religious about it. Olga tries everything to move the man out of his bed. She works really hard, but he's glued to his bedsheets. She keeps asking him, "Where are we? When are we going to get married? We need to talk." But Oblomov has a way to deflect all these tough questions and negotiations. The fear of marriage is deep inside every man unless he thinks he's found the only one. Oblomov keeps telling her that he loves her the way she is, and why can't she love him for the way he is? Oblomov has a point here. Why can't a woman love a lazy man? Why do women only love ambitious men? Well, society doesn't improve if men stay in bed all day. Someone has to do the work, someone has to collect your rubbish, someone has to run things in society. Olga tries to convince the man to get out of bed and do something. Have some passion and ambition. Oblomov says his ambition is to stay in bed. His passion is sleep. What's wrong with that? Finally, Olga has had enough. You can move a mountain, but you cannot move Oblomov. She calls the engagement off. No woman wants to marry a lazy bugger. Despite calling the marriage off, Olga later on, even after her own marriage with someone else, still wants the man to change. Maybe it's in a woman's DNA to change a man, to push him to have ambition and goal. But Oblomov is the true champion when it comes to laziness. No woman can change him. It's important to note that Andrei Stolz is Oblomov's only good friend. Everyone around him is either a thief or a crook who steals his money left and right. If only Oblomov lived today, he would have installed some CCTV everywhere so he could watch everyone from his bedroom. But we are in 19th century Russia, where you have to go around and physically watch your employees. His only eye is Andrei, who helps him find the crooks in his state every time. But even he is unable to undo all the damages. At one point, Andrei Stolz says he has had enough, so he ends up traveling to Paris. Here's a little twist in the novel. Guess who he bumps into in Champs-Élysées or some other Parisian streets? Surely it's not Oblomov. The man is permanently in bed. You're right, it's not him. It's the beautiful Olga, the woman who tried to motivate Oblomov. But now she's in Paris. We are in Paris, the most romantic city in the world. Guess what happens? I guess when you meet someone abroad, there's a different feel to it. So the two fall in love. Forget about that lazy bastard Oblomov. We are in Paris, baby. They marry and they settle in Crimea near the Black Sea. Meanwhile, in Russia, Oblomov has had enough of his so-called friends who swindled money from him. He gets up and slaps one of them before telling him to pack his bag and leave. Well, that was something, so perhaps there's a hope the man might get up from his bed soon. But unfortunately, he doesn't. What does he do? He marries a widow landlady, Agafia, an older woman who looks after him. She cooks his food exactly the way he likes. She takes care of him just like a mother would take care of her baby. Oblomov is now married to the greatest woman in history and lives without any worry in the world. His dream of going back to his childhood is realized now. The man lives his days in bed and his nights in bed. Agafya doesn't ask questions, doesn't tell him what to do, and she herself does everything as the man wants, because she thinks Oblomov is a smart man. If you don't have to get out of bed, why should you? Goncharov here exposes that the elites of Russia didn't have to work hard because the peasants did all the work. Agafya, however, thinks Oblomov is onto something with his lazy lifestyle. Soon they have a child whose name might bring tears to her eyes. Oblomov, despite his philosophical level of laziness, admires his diligent, hard-working friend. So he names his son Andrei, after Andrei Stoltz. Not only that, Oblomov has an explanation for his laziness. He reasons he is suffering from a rare condition which he conveniently calls Oblomovitis, which means he cannot help staying in bed. It is an invented illness, of course. So Oblomov, despite being the laziest man on the planet, manages to invent a disease to cement his name in human history. Even in bed, you can achieve something. Oblomov dies to return to his heaven, a place that allows you to sleep forever, where nobody can wake you up, nobody can disturb you. There's no worry of someone stealing your money or how you manage your state. So philosophically speaking, Oblomov has a profound idea that life is nothing but an interval between two perpetual sleeps, one before you were born and one after your death. So he remained in bed to make sure he was ready for death, forever sleep. The novel ends when Andrei, his friend, adopts his son Andrei. Hopefully the future is looking up for Russia, now that we have a half German raising the little Andrei Oblomov. Analysis. Ivan Goncharov masterfully exposed the psychology of the Russian landed gentry as it was dying. The novel is like a canvas that unravels mostly through the dialogues of its characters, so the author has taken a minimal role in narrating the story. Instead, he's let the characters speak for themselves. And speak they do. They tell everything about a system on the verge of death. If Dostoevsky talked about the new ideas coming from Europe, Oblomov is quite the opposite. It exposes the illness of Russian society. 19th century Russia was going through rapid modernization. There was a new class of educated Russian intellectuals that were considered superfluous in the eyes of ordinary Russians, because they weren't doing any hard work. But Goncharov pokes fun at the landed gentry class as lethargic and lazy, which was holding Russia back. To give a little historical context, 2 years after the publication of this novel, the serf system was abolished in Russia in 1861. And 6 years later, slavery was outlawed in the United States in 1865, to give you a little global context. So there was a global movement towards a more liberal, egalitarian society. The old system was breaking down, and Oblomov personifies how lazy the system was and how much people wanted change in Russia. Dostoevsky liked Oblomov but disliked Goncharov, likening him to a petty official with an empty head. Goncharov was actually an official in the censor office in St. Petersburg. But Dostoevsky had a habit of insulting those whose ideas he didn't like. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground is his version of Oblomov, who has retreated underground in a state of inertia, as he calls it. But Dostoevsky's character is not critical of Russian traditions. Instead, he criticizes Western ideas. So Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground is his response to Oblomov, saying that what comes from the West is not all good. Yes, European science is useful, but when it comes to how to run a society and individuals having a meaningful life, European rational nihilistic ideas were destructive to Russia. Goncharov's juxtaposition of a half-German man and a lazy Russian nobleman is an important one here. But if you look at the subsequent historical events in Germany and Russia, there is an interesting contrast. In 1917, Russia went to the soft, cushiony economy of socialism, in which everyone was equal and nobody needed to work too hard because everyone got the same amount. At least on paper. In reality, of course, it was highly unequal. But 15 years later, in 1933, Germany went the opposite route, fascism, in which everyone worked extremely hard to make Germany productive and you got what you worked for. Socialism and Nazism differ in many ways, but when it comes to hard work, socialism is about taking it easy. Marx famously said, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner. In other words, you don't have to focus on one thing, but do things you enjoy. Nazism, on the other hand, promoted a winner-takes-it-all mentality. Aside from being a social satire, Oblomov is also a psychological novel. He is attached to his childhood when he lived in total oblivion to the problems of the world. As a grown man, he has seen how terrible the world is. Quote, having done with the cares of business, Oblomov liked to withdraw into himself and live in the world of his own creation. He was not unacquainted with the joys of lofty thoughts. He was not unfamiliar with human sorrows. Sometimes he wept bitterly in his heart of hearts over the calamities of mankind and experienced secret and nameless sufferings and anguish and a yearning for something far away, for the world perhaps where Stolz used to carry him away. Sweet tears flowed from his eyes. He is a man in search of his lost childhood, lost time. Change. Marcel Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time is considered one of the greatest novels of all time. Its central premise is how time changes you and how memory fights back. Oblomov's dream is the same. He wants to remain a child forever, if not in reality, at least through his memories. Quote, memories are either the greatest poetry when they are memories of vital happiness, or a burning pain when they touch dried wounds. Ivan Goncharov, just like Marcel Proust, understands the nature of time, how it changes you as if you're a different person. Here's another quote. Yesterday one has wished. Today one attains the madly longed for object. And tomorrow one will blush to think that one ever desired it. This became the main theme of Proust's novel, how time is changing us and how we die many times throughout our lives as we change and grow. Children cannot wait to grow up, but Oblomov, upon growing up, realizes it's a bad deal. A lot of responsibilities and not enough fun in the moment. So he wants to return to his childhood. This is very similar to The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, which I discussed previously. Children live in the moment, while grown-ups have to live in the future. To work for the future needs motivations and resilience. Resilience is taught and instilled into a child. Oblomov, however, is like a willow leaf, trembling with the littlest wind. He has grown up without care and as a result has become too weak for his own good. To toughen up, a man has to be taught discipline and put to the test throughout his childhood. Oblomovitism. Laziness basically boils down to conserving your energy. Pandas and sloths and humans all try to take the paths of least resistance. We don't want to work, fight, and struggle if we don't have to. So why do we get out of bed? Well, outside survival instincts like eating and procreating, evolution has also put a chip inside us. It's called boredom, which propels us to get out of our arses and do something. Oblomov lived during feudalism when the vast majority of people had to toil in the field. Today, however, the economy has shifted to less active working conditions thanks to machines doing the hard labor jobs. As a result, people have grown bigger. So today's Oblomov is not a rich landowner dude, but more those at the bottom of socioeconomic ladder who have access to more readily available and healthy food. Stress eating is a phenomenon today where people overeat due to psychological stress or anxiety. Oblomov points out that when you don't have a purpose in life, you live day to day. Quote, when you don't know what you are living for, you don't care how you live from one day to the next. You are happy the day has passed and the night has come. And in your sleep, you bury the tedious question of what you live for that day and what you are going to live for tomorrow. This mode of existence is common today where people buy things they can't afford just using their credit card, fueling a consumerist lifestyle. When you feel empty on the inside, you fill it with something. But laziness is not all bad. Laziness turns to boredom, and boredom triggers creativity. So I say, be lazy until you get bored, then turn that into something beautiful. Oblomov invented a disease, but more than that, he gave us a deeper perspective on laziness and sleep. We slept for millions and millions of years. Then we lived for a little while, which he himself spent in his bedroom. Once we die, we return to perpetual sleep that lasts millions and billions of years. So life is being awake for a while. Whether you spend it in your bed or somewhere else, live it to the fullest. Oblomov turned laziness into an art form, which is incredibly profound and beautiful in of itself. Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev introduced one of the greatest and most famous Russian characters of all time, Yevgeny Bazarov personified the philosophy of Russian nihilism that started in the 19th century and culminated in the 20th century with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Fathers and sons' influence on Dostoevsky is apparent, especially in the brothers Karamazov, Notes from Underground, and Crime and Punishment. All three novels I've reviewed here. Also note that Fathers and Sons was published in 1862, 4 years before Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and 7 years before Tolstoy's War and Peace. So it is a pioneer of Russian literature. In this video, I'll summarize the story, discuss Russian nihilism, why Bazarov is called the greatest nihilist, and how Turgenev masterfully builds, develops, and transforms his characters so devastatingly skillfully, like a true artist that breaks your heart. I have broken down the novel into 5 major conflicts depicted by Turgenev, a master of show, don't tell. But first, let me give you a quick overview of Russia at the time. Turgenev was born in 1818 and died in 1883, so he lived at the time when Russia was going through a huge social and cultural shift. Generations before Turgenev saw Russia expand east in Siberia and south in Central Asia and the Caucasus, while also adapt science and technology trickling down from the West. Also, modern education became more widely available for many people. As a result, a new generation of educated young Russians were looking to the West, mainly Germany, France, and England, as great models for future modern Russia. So this created a generational divide among the educated Russians. The older generations were more attached to the traditional Russian values and the Orthodox Church, while the educated youth wanted to destroy these traditions in order to build something completely new, a modern European-style society based on individual freedom and economic materialism. Turgenev noticed a crack not only in Russian society as a whole, but most crucially in the family, the oldest institution that has stood the test of time. Individualism brought forward by modernity challenged the family as a unit. But in this novel, family fights back, blood being thicker than ideology, but most importantly, it is love that triumphs over everything else. Atsi et Deti, or Fathers and Children, translated as Fathers and Sons, is a short novel, only 220 pages, but it introduced one of the greatest characters in Russian literature, Bazarov, an anti-hero hero, a westernized young man who believed in nihilism and wanted to uproot all Russian traditions and values in order to build something new, often described as the first Bolshevik in Russia, even though he wasn't a socialist, or as one of Turgenev's friends described him, someone like Genghis Khan, who wanted to destroy everything. Bazarov didn't believe in renovating the house but demolishing so he could build a new Russia. He's brazen but also extremely determined, focused, and works hard in pursuit of hard science. Today we might call him a determined and focused entrepreneur-type personality. His cold, stoic personality typifies that Russian character in most Hollywood movies who always says, "Niet," religion, "Niet," love, "Niet," traditions, "Niet," old values, "Niet," art, "Niet." So here's his story. First conflict. Parents meet their children. It's the 20th of May, 1859. At a country inn, a father is impatiently waiting for his son, Arkady, to return home after studying in the city of St. Petersburg for a long time. This is just one of the many moving scenes in the novel. Arkady has also brought with him his new friend, Bazarov, a student of medical science whom he admires immensely for his radical ideas about Russia and Europe. Arkady's family has a large estate in the countryside, while his friend Bazarov has come from a poorer background, so the two friends have decided to stay at the bigger house for a few days, then visit Bazarov's family later on. Arkady's father, Nikolai, is very happy to see his son, but also extremely nervous. Soon we learn why. He has impregnated a maid in his household, therefore he is nervous what his son might say to him. This is very clever of Turgenev as he reverses the father-son roles in that the father has made a mistake and is afraid of his son's judgment. But it turns out the young men are extremely open-minded about it. Arkady says to his father, quote, "It's not for a son to sit in judgment on his father, least of all for me, and least of all with a father like you, who has never restricted my freedom in any way." Nikolai is relieved, But at the same time, he is slightly troubled by how radical and practical the young boys are in thinking, especially Bazarov, who is very much preoccupied with things like dissecting frogs or German science than the people he meets. When Nikolai admires that his son has graduated college, Arkady tries to change the conversation from emotional to something practical, as it makes him uncomfortable. Turgenev contrasts how parents and children deal with emotions. Educated young men are no longer sentimental like their parents. In this house there is also another man, Arkady's uncle, Pavel, who likes Russian way of life, so he's extremely irritated by Bazarov's love for radical European ideas. So the two men come head to head, but let's leave that conflict for later. After a few days of stay, the two young men travel to Bazarov's family's house, which is much more modest compared to Arkady's family state. Bazarov's father is a simple country doctor, very similar to Madame Bovary's husband in Gustave Flaubert's novel, who incidentally was a close friend of Turgenev. Bazarov's parents are very happy to see him, although his father tries to contain his emotion, but you know how much he loves his son. Also, Turgenev is the artist of subtlety. When Bazarov meets his father, a man in love with his son, yet knows he cannot show affection toward a grown-up son who is more educated than him, which is incredibly cute. Bazarov's father tells his wife to curb her emotions a bit. Turgenev writes, but his own lips and eyebrows were twitching too, and his chin trembled, though he obviously tried to master his feelings and appear almost indifferent. His mother, however, is overwhelmed with emotion to see her son. Turgenev describes her as a dying breed of Russian women, devout wives, religious, and infinitely caring, yet not very bright or ambitious. Bazarov looks down on his parents and their way of life. Here's a quote. Yes, Bazarov began, man's a strange being. When you look at a quiet, dull life like my good parents' life here, cursorily or from a distance, you'd think what could be better. Eat, drink, and you know you're acting in the most correct, sensible way. But that's not how it is. Boredom descends. You want to engage with people, even if just to shout at them, but still engage with them. Bazarov is irritated by his mother's too much affection, so he pushes her away. He behaves very rudely towards his father too, and Arkady is shocked to witness his friend's behavior, because he had always been very rational, level-headed and cool, but now treats his parents with contempt. Arkady reassures Bazarov's parents that their son is a talented man with a very bright future. This is a very moving scene, as the parents are so happy to hear this from someone who comes from a higher socio-economic status. I should also point out that both Arkady's and Bazarov's parents try very hard to understand their kids and try to show they are progressive and they keep up with what's fashionable among people. They're not closed off. The reason is that the parents try very hard to be supportive of their kids. Normally, the stereotype is that parents tend to be closed-minded and kids open-minded. Turgenev puts this on its head. It's the sons who are stubbornly convinced of their ideas, especially Bazarov. Turgenev shows that the young men, one poor and one rich, treat their parents very differently. The rich Arkady is quite respectful of his parents, while the poor Bazarov has a very deep disdain towards his parents, at least at the beginning of the novel. One has a deeper root, while the other has shallow root. But the real reason for Bazarov's erratic behavior is something else, something brewing inside him that has started a titanic battle with his rational mind. It is his heart. So we come to the second conflict in the novel. Second conflict, boys meet girls, reason versus passion. While in the country, the two friends take a trip to another province to meet a relative of Arkady's. While there, they meet two beautiful sisters, Anna and Katya Odintsov. Anna, the elder of the two sisters, invites the two young men to stay with her for a couple of weeks. Russians are extremely hospitable people. Anna, being beautiful, is used to men's attention, and every man she meets tries to seduce her. But Bazarov shows no interest in her whatsoever. Anna finds Bazarov's cold demeanor towards herself extremely charming. Quote, she found something new in him which she had never encountered before, and she was curious. No, she is not curious, but she likes Bazarov. Bazarov, however, is a man of science who thinks romantic love is nothing but a load of bullshit. Anna, despite being charmed by him, she sees Bazarov as a column of steel, with the strong opinions and clarity of mind of a crystal. His friend Arkady, however, has fallen madly in love with Anna. Now a woman has wedged herself between the two friends. Bazarov stands firm like a Greek column, reminding himself that romance is nothing but fiction. But the longer he spends time with Anna, the more things stir inside him. He rationalizes his feelings as nonsense, but soon the spring turns into a gushing stream and he can no longer contain it. Yes, he knows he has fallen in love with her, and his philosophical principles crumble one after another. You could say that the man believes in things until he meets a woman. Seeing this, Arkady no longer has the same energy to follow Bazarov's opinions, and also has his own romantic feelings to look after. Bazarov finally confesses his love to Anna, but Anna is smart and sees no future with Bazarov, so she refuses him. You see what Turgenev did here? He used Anna to transform Bazarov, but there are more dramas and transformations to come. The two friends leave Anna and Katya and then visit Bazarov's family, which I already discussed. So Bazarov's sullen and rude behavior at his parents' house was partly due to his internal battle between his head and his heart, between rationality and passion, between science and romantic love, and that's why he behaved erratically. The man has lost his clarity of mind. Turgenev is a master of juxtaposition. Here's a quote when the two friends are chilling in a quiet village, but inside Bazarov a tornado is brewing. Everything was still, only the cocks in the village crowed lustily, producing a curious drowsy lethargy in all who heard them. And somewhere high up in the treetops, a young hawk repeated its incessant, querulous note. Arkady and Bazarov lay in the shade of a small haystack. They had made pillows for themselves of 2 armfuls of grass which rustled dryly, though it was still green and fragrant. However, despite the tranquility of the village inside Bazarov, something is stirring and boiling. After a few days at Bazarov's parents', they go back to Arkady's house. Here, Bazarov continues in his erratic behavior. One day, he kisses the family's maid who was impregnated by Arkady's father, and this culminates into a real violence between him and Pavel, Arkady's uncle. So this is our third conflict in the story between two men, one modern, one traditional. Since we are in Russia, how do you resolve disagreement after someone kisses your woman? You call a duel. Third conflict, West meets East, nihilism versus traditionalism. There's nothing that binds generations together except traditions and values. Parents impart those values to their children and the story continues. However, in Fathers and Sons, Turgenev introduces nihilism, which basically means destruction of all values and traditions that came before. Everything is judged with a scientific lens. Now here's a good time to talk about Bazarov's nihilism. Though fictional, he is considered one of the greatest Russian nihilists, simply because he was the first to cement the ideology in Russia. What is nihilism? Derived from Latin word nihil, which means nothing, it has the negative connotation of believing in nothing. But to quote Arkady, a nihilist is a man who doesn't acknowledge any authorities, who doesn't accept a single principle on faith, no matter how much that principle may be surrounded by respect. In other words, nihilism rejects anything sacred, all values including religion, traditions, customs, and even art, because they don't have material utilities and benefits. Nihilism sees everything from the perspective of its utility. Thus, it's close to utilitarianism, which advocated the greatest happiness for the greatest number, even at the cost of nature, art, and traditions. Today, we might say it's close to materialism and consumerism. It was also a kind of atheism that stood against all religious values. At the time in Russia, nihilism was treated something akin to anarchism today, for their goal is to dismantle the older social fabrics. So basically, for nihilists, nothing is sacred anymore. Bazarov, whose name derived from the Persian word bazar, stands for marketplace. Thus, everything is bought and sold with money. So he wants to uproot all old Russian values and tradition and replace them with modern values based on science, reason, market materialism. Today we could call it consumerism. Here's a quote. We base our conduct on what we recognize as useful. In these days, the most useful thing we can is to repudiate. And so we repudiate. I think Turgenev's own biggest problem with Bazarov and other nihilists was their view of art. Why? Because art doesn't have any material utility of its own, so Bazarov rejects it right away as futile. He says, a decent chemist is 20 times more useful than any poet. So the only art, he says, is the art of making money. Thus we have the Soviet art and architecture as being bland, utilitarian, and ugly. Now, Turgenev uses his other character, Pavel, Arkady's uncle, to attack Bazarov's nihilism. Here's the irony though. Pavel was also educated in Europe, but he loves Russian idealism and represents the romanticism of the Russian aristocracy. Pavel also has a deep disdain for the Europeans, especially the Germans, whom he calls Teutons out of contempt. For him, nihilism is a kind of European brutalist style that is cold, rational, and lacks all emotions. The argument between Bazarov and Pavel heats up slowly and culminates when Bazarov kisses the maid. We are in Russia, so a duel is called for. In the duel, Bazarov shoots and injures Pavel. Seeing Pavel injured on the ground, Bazarov starts to shake a bit on the inside. Here, the sight of blood forces Bazarov to question his rational ideas. But he's still a man trained in medical science. He sees it his duty to treat the injured man, even though they were arch enemies a moment ago. This moment of violence turns two enemies into two friends. This is the second most important and most transformative scene in the novel, the first being falling in love with Anna. Bazarov decides to return to his own family home and to help his father in his medical field. So we enter the fourth conflict in Fathers and Sons, which is idea versus reality. Fourth conflict. Ideas meet reality. Bazarov returns to his family and takes up the gloves to work with his father, a low-level doctor. Turgenev depicts the young intellectual torn between his grand convictions and reality of the world, being from a lower depth of socio-economic corner of Russian society. So no matter how educated you are, if you don't have the socio-political means, you cannot affect change. Reality tests your ideas and your mettle, and it tests your honesty about how much you believe in what you believe. Bazarov, as his name suggests, was like a traveling salesman, fascinated by German science, engineering and technology, which was part of a trend in Russia. The ultimate message here is that you cannot separate feelings from rationality. You cannot be the most rational person, almost a robot. You still have the emotions that can override all those rational thoughts at times. It is emotion that create beauty and happiness as well as unhappiness. Reason alone is not enough. No wonder Karl Marx, the German philosopher and economist, had a massive impact on Russia as well as Chinese history. Incidentally, a prominent Bolshevik, Vladimir Bazarov, adopted the name Bazarov after the character in this novel as his pseudonym. Unlike Bazarov, Arkady, on the other hand, is more grounded in reality, so he does manage to fall in love with Anna's sister, Katya, and with the help of Bazarov, they get married and live happily ever after. But things go from bad to worse for Bazarov. But let's move to the most heartbreaking fifth and final conflict in Fathers and Sons, which is life versus death. Fifth conflict, life meets death. Quote, death is an old story but new for each person. One day while dealing with a corpse, Bazarov forgets to wear his gloves. Accidentally, he injures himself and infects himself with typhoid. There's a hint he might have done it on purpose, or he was a very clumsy doctor. Now he's certain to die soon. A man of science now has become the victim of a scientific mistake. He says, quote, there was a time when I used to say, I'll do many things in life and refuse to die before I have completed those tasks, for I am a giant. But now I have indeed a giant's task in hand, the task of dying as though death were nothing to me. His only wish is to see Anna one last time. She arrives to fulfill his last wish and gently kisses him on his forehead. This is an incredibly moving scene in the novel. Bazarov finally dies and you see his father and mother embracing each other, which is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the novel. They had every hope for their son. They loved him dearly, but unfortunately he was gone. A man who believed in nothing turns into dust and becomes nothing. But his memories are with his parents until they die and take those memories with him to their own graves. Okay, 3 things I love about Turgenev in general and this novel in particular. First, his language is incredibly beautiful. He is an example. Time sometimes flies like a bird and sometimes crawls like a snail. But man is happiest when he does not even notice when time is passing quickly or slowly. There's no Russian writer as good as Turgenev when describing nature. Second, for Turgenev, love and art triumphs over everything else. It is the love of parents for their children is the strongest force that thwarts all rational ideas. Art is the language of human passion, so no matter how scientific your thinking is, art always speaks to you in a way that's difficult to articulate with science or philosophy. And art represents beauty not able to see through the science or scientific methods. Science may bring physical comfort, but it's art that answers psychological questions. This novel, a work of art, is incredibly poetic and incredibly moving about the human condition and how generations differ, reconcile, and navigate the often treacherous existence. And finally, Turgenev lets his characters grow so nothing seems contrived or forced. Bazarov's transformation, every step of it is convincing and natural. At the beginning, he pits the young man against the older generations, and you see the old have nothing to offer. Then Turgenev pits the young man against their own inner romantic passion, and they are totally helpless. You might think Bazarov is one-dimensional, but you will be surprised how interesting he is despite his many flaws. Turgenev's genius was to let his characters do the talking, so they come off as genuine people. Despite the subject matter being philosophy, politics, and social change, the novel has a massive emotional weight, and it's devastating at times, and especially the ending leaves you in tears. Turgenev doesn't tell you how he judges his characters. He doesn't tell you which side is right and which side is wrong. He doesn't tell you who should you like or dislike. He shows you his characters at their worst and at their best, and you, the reader, be the judge of it all. Turgenev is a master of creating an experience. He's not judgmental. He lets the readers to be the ultimate judges of his characters. And that's why some people find it frustrating, but a lot of people find it refreshing as well. The novel ends with these words. Yevgeny Bazarov lies buried in this grave. Often from the little nearby village, 2 frail old people, a husband and wife, make their way there. Supporting each other, they walk with heavy steps. They go up to the iron railing, fall on their knees, and weep long and bitterly. And long and yearningly they gaze at the silent stone beneath which their son is lying. Exchanging a brief word, they brush the dust from the stone, set a branch of fir tree right, and then resume their prayers, unable to tear themselves away from the place where they feel near to their son, to their memories of him. But all those prayers of theirs, those tears, all fruitless? Is their love, their hollowed, selfless love, not omnipotent? Oh yes. However passionate, sinful, and rebellious the heart hidden in the tomb, the flowers growing over it peep at us serenely with their innocent eyes. They speak to us not only of eternal peace, of the vast repose of indifferent nature, they tell us too of everlasting reconciliation of life which has no end. The Brothers Karamazov is considered one of the greatest and most profound Russian novels of all time. But what is the story and why it's important? What are the 3 main philosophies discussed? What was Dostoevsky's purpose in writing it? And what are some of its weaknesses? And finally, what is it really about? This is a summary and analysis of The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Often called his magnum opus, The Brothers Karamazov was Dostoevsky's last novel, published 1 year before his death in 1881, but it's also his longest novel, almost twice the length of his other famous novel, Crime and Punishment, which I have already summarized here. First, I'll give you a full summary and then give you a few points of analysis, mainly the three major philosophies that run through the novel. At the end, I'll tell you Dostoevsky's main purpose in writing this novel, which might surprise you. Summary. First, let me tell you that the plot of The Brothers Karamazov is a murder, in which the father is killed, but we don't know which son has killed him. But that's the surface level story. It goes much deeper into religion, philosophy, and psychology. These are a staple of Dostoevsky's themes. Before I go any further, let's meet the Karamazov family, perhaps the most dysfunctional family in Russia. The father is Fyodor Karamazov, who has 3 kids from 2 marriages. He's also got an illegitimate 4th son who also plays a major role in the plot. Fyodor Karamazov is not the best father in Russia. He prefers to enjoy life instead of taking care of his kids. His philosophy is that life is short, you might as well enjoy it. As a result of this hands-off approach to raising kids, he has 3 very different sons with very contrasting worldviews and personalities. The eldest is Dmitri, who's most similar to his father. He loves alcohol and women, so when he grows up, he demands his father for his share of the family's wealth, so he can get married. This father-son conflict starts off the whole drama of this novel. The second son, Ivan, is an intellectual who questions why there is so much suffering in this world. So he concludes that the Almighty doesn't exist, otherwise he would not allow so much suffering. Or this God is not good and compassionate that allows innocent children dying. Ivan is perhaps the young Dostoevsky himself, who was drawn to atheism and Western ideas at the time. His third son and the youngest, Alyosha, is the protagonist of the novel. He's a good-hearted religious boy who spends a lot of time in a church with an old priest called Father Zosima. Fyodor Karamazov, the father, also has a 4th son out of wedlock, Pavel Smerdyakov, who is employed as a servant in the family. He is not considered very bright, so he gets easily influenced by the atheist Ivan. So the father and his 4 sons are the main family in the novel. I wonder why Dostoevsky didn't give Karamazov a daughter. Perhaps with a female presence, they might have been less dysfunctional, therefore less interesting as a story. There are so many characters in the novel, but the father and his 3 legitimate sons and 1 bastard son are the main characters in the story. Father Zosima is a priest who counterbalances Ivan's atheism and also a mentor to Alyosha, the youngest Karamazov. The 2 main female characters are 2 young women, Grusha and Katya, who are romantically involved with Dmitri, the eldest Karamazov. At the end of the novel, both women turn somewhat religious thanks to the works by Alyosha. The main plot of the novel revolves around money, specifically family inheritance. The eldest son, Dmitri, demands his share of the family money so he can get married to his fiancée, but his father, Fyodor, refuses. Why? It turns out the father and his son, Dmitri, love the same woman, Grusha. Grusha, on her part, plays the 2 men against each other and enjoys watching them tear each other apart. It turns out Grusha was hurt by some other men, so this is her revenge on men. But she also gets jealous as Dmitri gets engaged to Katya, another prominent female character in the novel. Then we have a few long detours in the novel in which Dostoevsky tells us separate stories. In fact, Dostoevsky wrote these stories in different periods in his life and then patched them together here. Why? Because he knew it would be his final novel before his death a year later. The first of these subplot stories is a little boy, Ilyusha, not to be confused with the main character, Alyosha. Ilyusha is bullied by his peers and later dies of humiliation caused by Dmitri Karamazov attacking the little boy's father. I'll tell you later why childhood is perhaps the most important theme in the novel. Another major subplot is the story of a Spanish inquisitor who is visited by Jesus to tell him to curb his brutality against non-Christians. As you know, in the 15th century, during the Inquisition in Europe, thousands of Jews and Muslims were forced to convert to Christianity, and those who refused were burned alive or killed in horrific ways. So Dostoevsky tries to answer whether force is justified in putting people in line. So here Jesus returns to tell the Grand Inquisitor that his actions are not justified. You cannot kill or torture people to make them Christian. But the Grand Inquisitor turns the table and imprisons Jesus to teach him that Jesus is too idealistic and has no understanding of human nature. He tells Jesus that force is needed to turn humans into good humans. If left to their own device, as in free will, humans turn nasty. I guess this might be due to Dostoevsky reading Darwin, that humans are basically beasts, and it was society, mainly religion, that civilized them. Without force, they cannot find the right path, so free will is not the answer, but social force is necessary to make people become good. This story is told to Alyosha, but it's meant to teach Ivan, the atheist, that rationality cannot beat love. Jesus represents love, and Grand Inquisitor is the symbol of rational thinking. Love triumphs over science and reason, so to speak. A third subplot is the story of Father Zosima, who was a young rebel but was saved by his Christian faith. Later in the novel, when he dies, his followers expect his body not to decay due to his religious piety, but soon the smell is so terrible that shakes everyone's faith in his holiness, but also religious faith as a whole. Nobody is more devastated than his protege, Alyosha, the young Karamazov. But then he meets Grusha, Dmitri's romantic interest, who restores his faith. A little female touch, I suppose, helps Alyosha to continue in spreading his message of love. Nothing sexual, but a more religious connection. This is the same in Crime and Punishment when Raskolnikov meets Sonia. He feels unburdened and ultimately agrees to confess his crime. I think Dostoevsky believed that women in general heal troubled men. So now we know that Karamazov family was dysfunctional precisely because there was no female presence in the family. Now let's return to the main plot. Dmitri is tired of dealing with his father and decides to run away with his lover Grusha, but she has disappeared. Here Dmitri panics, thinking that she might have chosen his father as a lover instead. Why? The father has all the money while Dmitri is broke. Dmitri goes to his father's house with a pestle as a weapon to attack his father. Dostoevsky here plays a trick where the story suddenly stopped. So the next time we see Dmitri, he attacks a servant who tries to stop him from fleeing the house. The servant also accuses him of killing his father, Fyodor Karamazov. Soon the police arrest Dmitri and charges him for the murder of his own father. What is the evidence? A witness seeing him flee the house and a pestle as a weapon. But the damning evidence is that a lot of money is missing and Dmitri suddenly has a huge stack of cash with him. He tries to explain that this money belongs to his fiancée, but the police are not convinced. Meanwhile, Alyosha, the youngest Karamazov, continues to spread his goodness and love. He meets Kolya, a young boy who is westernized and radicalized without really understanding these Western philosophies like atheism, socialism, and nihilism. On the other hand, we have the atheist Ivan, who is depicted as having a negative influence on those around him. One person in particular, Pavel Smerdyakov, his bastard brother, who confesses to Ivan that he actually killed his father and stole the money. So Dmitri is innocent. Ivan asks Smerdyakov why kill his father. He says because earlier Ivan had told him that in the absence of God, anything was permissible. So in a sense, Ivan is also implicated in the murder of his own father. Here we see Ivan turning into Raskolnikov, terrorized by his own demons, delirium, and insanity. Because deep down he knows he's responsible for the murder too by influencing Smerdyakov that there was no God and any act was permissible. Later, Ivan learns that Pavel Smerdyakov has committed suicide, which relieves him that now he cannot be implicated in the murder. Dmitri is tried and found guilty in court. The whole trial exposes the nastiness and resentment of those involved. Dostoevsky shows how irrational human beings really are when it comes to justice system. It's not about justice, but revenge. The justice system is also corrupt because it sends Dmitri, an innocent man, to prison. Dmitri is sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in, you guessed it, Siberia. Siberia is a place where bad people are corrected in Russia. Good people stay in the city and bad people are sent to the cold. If you do something bad in Russia, just be prepared to live in the cold of Siberia for a few years. Dmitri has a plan to escape to America and then years later return to Russia under a different name. But we don't know if he manages to do that or not. Alyosha still continues to spread his religious love, mostly among young boys. Ivan, the atheist, goes mad and is taken to a hospital. So to conclude the brothers Karamazov, the father, Fyodor Karamazov, the rich pleasure seeker, is murdered. His eldest son, Dmitri, also a pleasure seeker, is found guilty, despite the fact that he is innocent. Here, Dostoevsky shows that we suffer no matter whether we are guilty or not, because life is suffering. Poor people around the world live in terrible conditions, not of their own fault. His second son, Ivan, the rational atheist, goes insane. Irony there. His bastard son, Pavel, the real murderer, commits suicide. For Dostoevsky, the guilty brother is Ivan, the atheist, as it was he who influenced Pavel that anything is permissible, including murder. His youngest son, the protagonist of the novel, Alyosha, continues to spread religious message of love. Dostoevsky wanted to show him as his ideal reader, as he's young and somewhat innocent and naive, as he watches different ideologies and outlooks collide so they can learn how to live his life, which is to love everyone, no matter if you're guilty or innocent, poor or rich, bad or good. At the end of the novel, the young kids who bullied a child attend the funeral of the young victim to show remorse. This shows that no matter how small an action of bullying or even insulting words can have huge consequences in someone's life. One must take responsibility for their actions, no matter how trivial it may seem. Analysis. The writing is very fluent, conversational, and improvised, but also messy, perhaps telling us that Dostoevsky had a cluttered mind with many philosophies and ideas in some titanic battle inside his head. You don't want to be in Dostoevsky's head. Dostoevsky shows his love for the ordinary people here. Dmitri, despite chasing women, money, and alcohol, has an honesty that Dostoevsky admires. He finds the intellectual Ivan secretive, dishonest, and coward. Today we see those negative traits in bankers, politicians, clever people who play the system so well that they never get caught, and usually the ordinary people who pay the price for the actions of those smart but selfish people. Dmitri gets sent to jail, not Ivan, who masterminds the whole thing. So usually the innocent pays the price. I think for Dostoevsky, reason and rational thinking doesn't make your life easier. Psychologically speaking, of course. Materially speaking, rationality makes life easier by inventing tools and techniques for an easier life. But when it comes to psychological happiness, Dostoevsky prefers less rationality but more naivety. Why? Guilt only comes when you knowingly do something. Intelligence makes your life more complicated, and smart people are less happy than those who are naive. It is simplistic to say that Dostoevsky agrees that ignorance is bliss, but he definitely thinks knowing too much makes your life harder. This runs in his other novels too, most clearly in The Idiot. Dostoevsky famously said that consciousness was a disease. So according to Dostoevsky, we should curb our intelligence, curb our knowledge, and have faith and trust in people and the world around us. Don't question everything. Philosophies. Three main philosophies are present in the novel. First, on the left we have Ivan, who is an atheist and represents Western Enlightenment philosophy of rationalism. He believes that everything should be scientifically proven before he can trust it. His main question is why there is so much suffering in the world, especially innocent children dying. Either God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he is not a good God to allow so much pain. Dostoevsky, by depicting Ivan going insane at the end of the novel, believes rationalism ultimately leads to nihilism. Around the same time, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, had the same conclusion. But Nietzsche offers art as an answer to the problem of nihilism. Dostoevsky has love as an antidote. The second philosophy is hedonism, which is a middle ground for Dostoevsky. We have Fyodor the father and Dmitri. Both represent a more hedonistic philosophy of life, where the focus is more on pleasures of life, that life is short, you have to enjoy it. But this also brings a violence in the mix, as you are less careful and less responsible. Romanticism in Europe grew in response to Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment philosophy of rationalism. They focused on the emotions and passions, which is creative but also can be volatile and even violently destructive. And finally, the third philosophy is the religious faith on the right, as we have Alyosha and Father Zosima, who believe in religious faith. A bit dogmatic, but also they believe in love as the only way to treat others. Dostoevsky leans towards religion here. He was on his deathbed, so it was perhaps his way of redeeming himself. Somewhat similar to George Orwell, who also turned religious at the end of his life, which I discussed in my video 10 Lessons from Orwell. Having said that, Dostoevsky also questioned religious absolutism, so there are many scenes where religious faith as dogma is robustly questioned. The most famous scene is Father Zosima's body putrefying, much to the dismay of his followers. So Dostoevsky didn't believe in saints, nor in pure evil. He thought every human being was capable of both, and one has to constantly battle to keep the balance. Both on the left and right, human idealism is the main theme. Atheism and religious faith are human idealized views, thus less practical. In the middle, you have the more animalistic pleasure-seeking people who don't fight their carnal desires. For Dostoevsky, idealism is not the answer, but being responsible towards fellow human beings matters the most. The responsibility to act well. In a way, Dostoevsky promotes naivety or innocence and love for everyone. Weaknesses. My biggest criticism is that Brothers Karamazov is not focused enough. There are too many subplots, so this can make the reading a bit tough for today's readers. If you condense the main story, you would probably get about 500 pages, not the current 1000 pages. As I said, several of the stories were written years earlier and he patched them together as he knew it would be his last novel. He died a year after its publication. In the same way, 266 by Roberto Bolaño puts 5 novels into one. Another thing that most people miss is that Dostoevsky wrote this as a childhood novel, which is not clearly elaborated until the very end, so these can make those early childhood sections a bit tedious to read. Another weakness might be its religious tone for those who are not religious. If you're a Christian reader, you might enjoy it, but readers who are not religious may find the Grand Inquisitor section a bit tedious. Having said that, the novel is very deep and nuanced, and the plot very intriguing. Another big pain in the butt is Russian names. This is not only in Brothers Karamazov, but in all old Russian novels. Each character has like 4 to 8 different names depending on who is calling them. For example, Alyosha, whose name is Alexei, is called Alyoshka, Alyoshenka, Alyoshka, Alyoshichik, Lyosha, and Lyoshenka. The more names a character has, the more important they are in the novel. Alyosha has 8, Dmitry 5, and Ivan 4. Final words. The ultimate message of the Brothers Karamazov is this. It is better to be naive or even stupid, but good, than smart, successful, but bad. In a way, Dostoevsky didn't like how capitalism's focus on ruthlessness and material success was ruining the innocence that permeated in the simple lives of the Russian peasants. Now, as promised at the beginning of this video, I'll answer what the Brothers Karamazov is really about. In this final novel, Dostoevsky was looking back at his own childhood, the innocence of 1820s, 200 years ago from today, away from the messy world of adulthood, Western ideas, and Siberian experience, gambling, and tons of other shitty things that grown-ups get involved in. Dostoevsky knew he was dying soon, so he wanted to tell other Russians that life is too short to do stupid revolutionary ideas to tear each other apart for money. A simple life is all you need. He wanted to take Russians to those good old days of simplicity and naivety. So The Brothers Karamazov is a novel of childhood, and Dostoevsky wrote it to preserve the childhood innocence that we lose when we grow up and learn the sinister world of adulthood, and we spend the rest of our lives to restore that childhood naivety but never manage. In other words, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That's it. So Dostoevsky tells us not to see everything, not to question everyone. Blind trust can cause suffering, but it's good in the long term. In a way, it's similar to Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time, in which Proust went back to his magical world of his childhood wonders, to recapture the lost time, the magic of not knowing the cynicism of this world, the magic of simplicity. So The Brothers Karamazov is a novel about the magic of childhood. Tolstoy says history books are like works of fiction. Great men of history like Napoleon are more like fictional heroes, created, shaped, and glorified by historians. What is the main premise of Tolstoy's masterpiece, War and Peace? What is it about? What is the plot? Why is it important? And why is it considered the greatest novel of all time? In this video, I'll tell you everything about this masterpiece. Vaina i Mir, or War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, published in 1869, is often called the greatest novel of all time. Everyone has heard of it, but few have read it, and even fewer have finished it. Tolstoy himself, however, didn't consider it a novel. Why? Because it's 3 books in one by combining history, philosophy, and fiction. So in this video, I'll discuss all 3 topics. First, I'll give you a brief historical context and Tolstoy's motivation in writing such a massive novel. Second, I'll summarize the main plot in 2 parts. Third, I'll discuss Tolstoy's philosophical approach to history. And finally, I'll leave you with a few points of analysis and an interesting quote at the end. So get your coffee and sit back and let me take you back to Russia in 1812 as Napoleon's French army of 400,000 strong were marching towards Moscow. After watching this video, you will know pretty much everything you need to know about Tolstoy's masterpiece, a beast of a novel of 1200 pages long with almost 600 characters, full of philosophical digressions and war strategies. Okay, before I summarize the novel, let me give you a little historical context. Catherine the Great, who ruled Russia from 1762 to 1796, made French her official court language, so most of the Russian nobility spoke French. Here is the irony though, Napoleon didn't have to invade Russia because those who ruled Russia were all French-speaking people. The Russian aristocrats loved French culture and they even read French literature. In fact, you could say Napoleon's invasion of Russia hindered French culture from flourishing in Russia. Instead, it cemented Russian culture and nationalism even more. Tolstoy's main character in War and Peace is a Francophile with a French name, Pierre, a Russian educated in France. So Tolstoy was making a point here. In the 1860s, when Tolstoy was in his mid-30s, while visiting Paris, he met Victor Hugo, who had just published his masterpiece, Les Miserables, often called the greatest French novel of all time. So upon returning to Russia, Tolstoy, a newlywed and aching to write something big and spectacular, he settled himself behind a desk at his large country estate of Yasnaya Polyana to write a huge novel as ambitious as Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, or Balzac's Human Comedies, or Stendhal's Crystallization, or How Things Happen. Tolstoy wanted to understand Russia, especially what led to the emancipation of serfs in 1861 when 31 million Russians were suddenly free. Tolstoy knew this event had its root in 1820s, especially the Decembrist revolt of 1825, when the Russian aristocrats revolted against the Tsar, but failed. Tolstoy then thought to understand 1820s, he had to look what had happened before the 1812 Russian victory over Napoleon. And to understand that, he had to go back again to 1805, when Napoleon decisively defeated the Russians and Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. So War and Peace begins in 1805 and ends in 1820s. So Tolstoy was inspired by French literature, set himself the task of writing about the French-Russian wars. When Tolstoy started to write about the Napoleonic Wars, he quickly realized there were plenty of records about the military and political leadership or people of power, but not much about the peasants or soldiers who actually fought in the wars. Here came Tolstoy's realization that historians tend to fictionalize history by focusing on few major characters, while forgetting the people who do the fighting. Why? For the same reason novelists tend to create as few characters as possible for the sake of simplicity. So Tolstoy formed his own theory of history. The official history books are fictionalized version of history, so they solely focus on the kings and generals, in other words, fictional heroes. Tolstoy believed these so-called historical heroes, such as Napoleon, couldn't have changed the course of history by themselves. But it was the entire society, from those fighting in the trenches, to the peasants producing the food, to the farmers feeding the horses, and to the women who looked after the children. They all contributed to historical events, but historians hardly ever mention the millions of soldiers or ordinary men and women. Here's a quote. The movement of nation is caused not by power, nor by intellectual activity, nor even by combination of the two as historians have supposed, but by the activity of all the people who participate in the events, and who always combine in such a way that those taking the largest direct share in the event take on themselves the least responsibility, and vice versa. To illustrate this, let me give you an example. The reason most politicians break their promises is very simple. They are unable to implement change. So it's ridiculous to say history happened because of these men at the top. Tolstoy says when looking at a steam locomotive, historians tend to focus on the smoke and ignore the rest. For example, Will Drawn's history books are titled after an individual for the sake of simplicity and clarity. By focusing on these leaders, historians give them a kind of superhero power. History for Tolstoy is about an entire people, not just individual heroes who are pedestalized by historians. Here's a quote. There are two sides to the life of every man, his individual life, which is the more free, the more abstract its interests, and his elemental hive life, in which he inevitably obeys laws laid down for him. Man lives consciously for himself, but is an unconscious instrument in the attainment of the historic universal aims of humanity. A deed done is irrevocable, and its result coinciding in time with the actions of millions of other men assumes a historic significance. The higher a man stands on the social ladder, the more people he is connected with, and the more power he has over others, the more evident is the predestination and inevitability of every action. Tolstoy was a huge admirer of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher who believed that humans on the innate level are good, but society corrupts them, and he famously said that humans are born free but everywhere in chains. But he also used the Hegelian notion that we are the product of our time. A queen bee is not determining the course of a hive, but slave to its rules, just as soldier bees are. Quote, history, that is, the unconscious, general, hive life of mankind, uses every moment of the life of kings as a tool for its own purposes. So Tolstoy set himself to write a fictionalized history that focused on those people who are mostly ignored by historians. This is Tolstoy's Copernican revolution. He uses fiction to tell the true history of the Napoleonic Wars, which is ironic. He combines the military, social, emotional, and existential history of that period. So Tolstoy's War and Peace is a novel, a history book, and also a meditation on life. There's a saying that history is written by the victors, but literature is written about the outsiders, those who are ignored by history books. To make his point crystal clear, Tolstoy treats all his characters as real people with flaws and redeeming qualities, who make mistakes, forget things, often contradict themselves. So you really see them as genuinely real people. But the one character the guy historians spend most time talking about is depicted by Tolstoy as almost cartoonishly square as Mr. Napoleon. Just to poke fun at history books. Or perhaps Tolstoy looked down on Napoleon for invading his country, or because he was a short man. Tolstoy himself was a tall and huge man. Even his name Tolstoy in Russian means thick or fat. But I have to be fair, Tolstoy shows no prejudice towards the French, so in that sense he is a truly universalist. So Napoleon, the superhero of history books, is caricatured in War and Peace, while other characters who don't make it into history books are depicted as real humans by Tolstoy. Okay, now I'll summarize Tolstoy's War and Peace. This summary is delivered in 2 parts. Each part covers about half of the novel. Summary Part 1. The historical background of War and Peace is the Napoleonic Wars of 1805 and 1812. But the main story is about 5 Russian noble families in the span of some 15 years, before and after Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. The families are the Bezukhovs, the Bolkonskys, the Rostovs, the Kuragins, and the Drubetskoys. Okay, who is the protagonist of War and Peace? Tolstoy's entire philosophy was built on the importance of groups, not individual heroes. But I will go against Tolstoy here due to time constraint and tell you that out of 600 characters, 3 are pretty important characters in the novel. Napoleon is not one of them. The first main character is Count Pierre Bezukhov, a France-educated Russian, hence the name Pierre, but he's slightly awkward Russian who mostly resembles and represents Tolstoy himself and his way of thinking. So if you have to pick a protagonist in War and Peace, it's Pierre. The second character that is pretty important in the novel is Natasha Rostova, who we meet in 1805 when she's 13 years old and later on as a grown woman. She represents the passionate and spontaneous Russian woman full of life and energy. The third important character is Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, who is perhaps the most Russian of all male characters. He is a somewhat nihilistic intellectual who represents Russian pessimism, as well as the courage of not being afraid of death. He's perhaps the character Tolstoy wanted to be himself. Despite being a very rational person, he possesses that Russian value of bravery. Prince Andrei represents the rational side of Tolstoy, while Pierre represents the irrational, often indecisive, and impressionable side, who lacks clarity of thought and floats about until he finds an anchor among the Freemasons and also Natasha. So Prince Andrei is the Apollo, the man of reason, and Pierre is the Dionysian, man of impulsive emotion. Pierre as a character is outsider because he is an illegitimate son and also awkward. So it's apt to say that while history books are about victors, fiction, however, is about outsiders. Pierre doesn't feel at home in Russia because he's educated in France and loves Napoleon like a hero. Of course, later on, he is transformed by Tolstoy. Okay, we are in 1805 in St. Petersburg at a soiree, a social gathering of the Russian high society, including princes and princesses, counts, and all sorts, where we meet two of the main characters. Pierre, whose wealthy father, Count Bezukov, is on the verge of death and is about to inherit a good chunk of money, so he finds himself quite popular among everyone. He's in St. Petersburg to find a job, but his foreign education and awkward personality make it difficult to find a job. He listens to other people talk all kinds of shit, but he just listens. His best friend, Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, who is recently married, complains about his wife and is fed up with life in St. Petersburg. Here, Tolstoy draws on his own life, being married but not satisfied with life. Incidentally, despite loving his wife, Tolstoy had a very unhappy marriage. Back then, marriage was seen as an eternal road to happiness. But of course, we know that idealized expectation leaves you disappointed and sometimes in existential crisis. So, Prince Andrei, not happy at home, decided to join the army alongside Prince Mikhail Kutuzov, the main Russian general who defeated Napoleon in 1912. So far, we talked about people from two families, the Bezukovs, represented by Pierre, and the Bolkonskys by Andrei. Now, the action moves to Moscow, the former capital of Russia. St. Petersburg represents the new European Russia, a bit colder, being further north, and also being a bit more westernized and formal, therefore slightly fake and full of hypocrisy. Moscow, however, still has the charm of the old Russia, full of warmth and friendliness. In Moscow, we meet our third family in War and Peace, the Rostovs, mainly Count Ilya and his wife Natalia, and their 4 kids, one of which is our main female protagonist. Their 13-year-old daughter Natasha, a very spontaneous and vivacious girl who is in love with Boris, a boy from another family called the Drubetskoys, our 4th family in the novel. Boris is about to join the Russian army to fight Napoleon. The teenage Natasha remains one of the most important characters in the novel. She represents a kind of Russian woman who is full of energy and passion, who dances like crazy, but she doesn't care. In fact, she falls in love with several men throughout the novel, namely the 2 main male characters, Pierre and Prince Andrei. Later on, she becomes a very caring wife and mother. Some criticize Tolstoy for taming her wild character, but life and aging tame you, no matter how wild you are. Tolstoy writing always remains true to life. While we are in Moscow, the war is happening somewhere in the distance. You can't hear the gunshots yet, but it's happening in the Western Front. It's important to note that all these families know one another and have some sort of connections. The aristocrats in every country would stick with their own kind, so it's a small world, so to speak. Prince Andrei, the most pessimistic and most Russian character, tired of his marriage, leaves his pregnant wife alone to join the war against the French. Little did he know that his wife would die at childbirth and he himself would get wounded in the war. The action moves to the battleground, the 1905 Battle of Austerlitz, in which Napoleon inflicted a heavy defeat on the Russians and Austrians. Here we see Napoleon for the first time through Prince Andrei, when he is wounded and captured by the French army. Andrei, like all young men of that period, was fascinated by the character of Napoleon, just like the superhero of today. Here Tolstoy makes it clear how fictionalized Napoleon had become. While lying down on the ground, Napoleon happens to pass by. Here's a quote. "So insignificant at that moment seemed to me all the interest that engrossed Napoleon. So mean did his hero himself with his paltry vanity in joy and victory appear, compared to the lofty, equitable, and kindly sky which he had seen and understood." This reminded of Marcel Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time. When Marcel goes to Venice, the build-up and expectation are crushed when he sees Venice itself. Here, Tolstoy tells us the historical figures are not as big or heroic as our imaginations make them. So in essence, history is a work of fiction because Napoleon is made bigger because we are led to believe he was greater than he was. Tolstoy says, "Looking into Napoleon's eyes, Prince Andrei thought this insignificance of greatness, the unimportance of life which no one could understand, and the still greater unimportance of death, the meaning of which no one alive could understand or explain." Summary Part 2. Okay, our first main historical battle is over, with the French having a decisive victory against the Russians and Austrians. Now the second, the most important battle is coming up. But right now, enough wars, we move to Moscow again with Nikolai Rostov, Natasha's father. Here Tolstoy tells us about some romances blossoming among the youth of Russian aristocrats. Men propose and women reject. Parents want to marry their kids to richer kids for practical reasons. But you know kids, they're stupid to fall in love with their hearts, not head. So the topic of love, marriage, money fly around a lot. Speaking of money, our awkward main character, Count Pierre, has finally won the lottery. He has received a huge amount of money in inheritance. Now everyone wants to be friends with him and all the ladies want to marry him. He is the biggest prize in Moscow. But for Napoleon, of course, and the French army, however, Moscow itself is the real prize. But more on that later. With lots of money, Pierre has gained self-confidence and charm. He finally marries Elaine or Elena Kuragina, who comes from our fifth family in War and Peace, the Kuragins. She's very beautiful but a bit sexually liberated and often promiscuous. It's clear that she's after Pierre's money and doesn't love him. There's also a rumor that she may have had incestuous relationship with her own brother, Anatol Kuragin, a drunkard womanizer. Also possibly had an affair with another man called Fyodor Ivanovich Dolokhov, a psychopathic gambler. We are in Russia, so you know what happens. There is a duel, of course. Pierre against Dolokhov. Pierre injures Dolokhov in the duel. This experience transforms Pierre into a philosopher. In all Russian novels, duels are the most transformative event in the character's life. You either die, get injured, or your whole outlook on life changes. Pierre is no longer interested in his wife Elaine, but instead he's seeking to find the meaning of life and how to be a good man. So what does he do? He joins the Freemasons and becomes a pacifist. Tolstoy himself was a pacifist and even said to have influenced Mahatma Gandhi, the biggest pacifist in the 20th century. Around the same time, his friend Prince Andrei returns from the war physically wounded, but now also psychologically wounded because his abandoned wife died at childbirth, for which he blames himself, and as a result has become even more nihilistic and pessimistic about life. Also important to note that his superhero, Mr. Napoleon, was nothing but a disappointing character. Now the two troubled men, Andrei and Pierre, need some comfort. I mean womanly comfort. Elaine finally persuades Pierre to take her back. Prince Andrei, now a widower, falls in love with the lively Natasha Rostov. When love arrives, nihilism goes out of the window. This same thing happened in Turgenev's Father and Sons. But Andrei's father tells him that the Rostovs are not nice people. Also important to note that the Rostovs, despite their pomp, are a bit penniless. Andrei's father tells him if he wants to marry her, he should wait for a year to see if he still loves her. Andrei, being a sensible man, thinks this is a good advice, so he tells Natasha that he needs time. But he also tells Natasha that she's free to not wait for him, and that's what she does. While Andrei is waiting, the energetic young Natasha has a few romantic adventures here and there, and even considers an elopement with Anatol Kuragin, a hedonistic man who loves women and wine, who is supposedly have had sex with her sister Elaine, Pierre's wife. There are more rejections and scheming going on among the Russian nobility. Even Pierre, our philosopher, falls in love with Natasha. Her energy is infectious. When Andrei finds out about Natasha's transgressions, he is deeply hurt. But being a rationally mature man, he nurses his wounds quietly like an injured animal, so he doesn't make a scene about it. He heads to the battlefront. Men fight wars for two reasons, in the hope of getting a woman when victorious or escape a heartbreak. Andrei's heartbreak makes him even more determined to go to war. I talked about this in my video on George Orwell, that conflicts give us profound purpose in life. When you feel empty inside, you immediately look for some conflicts on the outside. Andrei is heartbroken by Natasha's youthful mistakes, so he heads to the battle. Pierre, however, lives a peaceful life, thus feels very empty. We humans need a battle, a struggle, or a conflict to keep us going or give us a purpose. Even joining the Freemasons didn't help Pierre much. So what does he do? He falls in love with Natasha, a woman who broke his best friend's heart. We humans always need some drama and chaos in our lives, don't we? In Tolstoy's novel, falling in love is like going to war. Even marriage, supposed to be peaceful, blissful, smooth sailing, is in fact conflict, contradictions, and often chaos. While the Russian high society is absorbed in their own romantic battles, Napoleon wants the whole Moscow, the whole Russia. The war is nearing. Pierre, our philosopher, connects a few dots about Napoleon being the Antichrist. so he decides it's time he helped his country, Mother Russia. We enter the Battle of Borodino, the most decisive battle in War and Peace, as well as history books. The violence is terrible, dead bodies everywhere. Tolstoy, in fact, used his own personal experience of fighting in the Crimean War of 1850s as an artilleryman and frontline soldier, so the scenes are extremely vivid and real. Even Pierre's best friend, the nihilistic Prince Andrei, is also among the casualties. His sacrifice symbolized the courage and bravery of the Russian soldiers in defending their country. But also on a personal level, he manages to forgive Anatol Kuragin for going behind his back and trying to elope with Natasha. This is a very moving scene, as Andrei again shows he is the bigger man in War and Peace, even bigger than Napoleon, because he forgives his enemy. It's important to note that Andrei is wounded, but he dies later in the care of his lover, Natasha, whose betrayal he forgives, but then, just like his early nihilistic tendencies, he loses his will to live. Quote, "But at that instant he died, Prince Andrei remembered that he was asleep. At that very instant he died. Having made an effort, he awoke. Yes, it was death. I died. I woke up. Yes, death is awakening." Here Tolstoy says that life is a dream and death is like waking up from that dream, which is really beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. The Russian army finally has halted the French advance, but decides on a tactical retreat to allow the French march on Moscow. Napoleon's French army, with their allies mainly the Poles, was the most sophisticated army at the time. The Russian army, however, was a kind of ramshackle group of peasants. The difference was, one was fighting for a genuine cause, defending their country. In fact, General Kutuzov often relied on instinct and intuition. At one point, when getting ready for the battle, his men ask him how to prepare. He tells them to have a good night's sleep. Kutuzov's approach is to go with the flow like wind, so almost mystical. Napoleon represents modernity, acting like a machine, while Kutuzov represents the flow of nature. Here's a quote. "By long years of military experience, he knew and with the wisdom of age understood that it's impossible for one man to direct hundreds of thousands of others struggling with death. And he knew that the result of a battle is decided not by the orders of the commander-in-chief, nor the place where the troops are stationed, nor by the number of cannon or of slaughtered men, but by that intangible force called the spirit of the army. And he watched this force and guided it in as far as that was in his power." Before abandoning the city, the Russians decided to burn Moscow. If we can't have it, we don't want the French to have it either. Napoleon finally enters Moscow, a city turned to ashes. Most people have left, but Pierre has remained behind. He has a slightly crazy plan. His plan is to stab evil in the eye. He wants to assassinate Napoleon himself. But he gets distracted from his big mission. In trying to be a hero to save an Armenian girl from robbers, he is captured by the French and his assassination plot is foiled. The French almost execute him, but he is spared at the last minute. While in captivity, he makes friends with a Russian peasant, Platon Karatayev, who symbolizes the Russian honesty, integrity, and simplicity. For Tolstoy, innocence is better than intelligence. Peasants are connected with land, so close to nature, therefore they have that raw honesty and integrity which the Russian nobility had lost. This reminded me of Dostoevsky's transformation while in prison in Siberia, when he came in contact with the ordinary Russians whom he almost falls in love with and spends the rest of his life defending them. Here Tolstoy unites the Russian peasants with the aristocrats. Tolstoy paints an ironic picture here. Pierre in prison finds a kind of spiritual freedom that he lacked on the outside. The burning of Moscow was perhaps a tactical genius because the French couldn't survive the harsh winter in a city of ash, so they had no choice but to retreat. When your back is against your enemy, you're most vulnerable. The Russians found the opportunity to attack them, depleting their army. Napoleon returns to France with his tail between his legs, humiliated, but most importantly lost 400,000 men. For what? Nothing. While in the hands of the French army as they retreat from Moscow, Pierre witnesses the terrible tragedies of war, and even his best friend Platon is shot dead by the French. Pierre himself, however, is lucky and rescued by Russian soldiers. He returns home to find that his wife has died of drug overdose. His best friend Prince Andrei is also dead. now a widower and friendless. What does he do? He finds love. He rekindles his romantic feelings with Natasha and they get married. There are two epilogues in War and Peace, one talking about the characters and the other explaining Tolstoy's philosophy behind the novel. Most readers find the second epilogue very annoying, anticlimactic. I think Tolstoy wanted to preemptively respond to his critics by giving a detailed response to how he interpreted history. Philosophical context. Okay, now it's a good time to talk about Tolstoy's philosophical inspiration for War and Peace. In other words, how he understood the world and how we can understand history in the first place. Tolstoy was influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer's Will and Representation. To understand this, let's briefly look at the two major secular philosophical schools in Europe, the rationalists and the empiricists. The rationalists believe that we understand the world through reason. The best example is René Descartes, who sat in his armchair and rationalized, "I think, therefore I am." So rationalists rely on ideas and thoughts to know what's going on. The empiricists, however, rely less on rational ideas but more on empirical data, i.e. our experience in the real world to understand the world. The empiricists were mostly English and Scottish philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and David Hume. So the rationalists say reason alone is enough to know the world, but the empiricists think experience let us know the world. So in how knowledge travels, rationalists is an inside-out approach, while empiricism is an outside-in approach. Then the German philosopher Immanuel Kant tried to bring these two schools, the rationalists and empiricists, together by arguing that we humans, by rationally categorizing the world, we impose our own structure on the world. So we are not passive observers of reality, but actively making reality conform to our categorizations. So according to Kant, the human mind actively uses experience as a kind of tool to probe, categorize, and understand the world. Kant also made a distinction between two realms, phenomena, reality as they appear to us, and noumena, or reality as it is. Arthur Schopenhauer adopted Kantian philosophy in his book Will and Representation, which is relevant to us here as this book influenced Tolstoy and his own philosophy developed in War and Peace. Schopenhauer argued that the world that appeared to us, i.e. reality or history, is not the world that actually exists independent of us. According to Schopenhauer, human will is like a lens through which we see and interpret and even study the world, which is a mere representation of the actual world. Schopenhauer also said that human will is the source of human misery, which is similar to the Buddhist philosophy that desire makes us suffer more. So to bring it full circle, Tolstoy argues that historical events are not the result of individual leaders' will or whim, but rather bigger social forces or the will of the entire society that take a country to war, not its leaders. Hitler couldn't have mobilized Germany if the socio-economic conditions weren't right. Napoleon, according to Tolstoy, was somewhat like a puppet, an accidental leader pushed forward to lead the French. If he were to come at a different period in history, he would not have been able to mobilize a small village, let alone the entire French nation. Tolstoy subscribed to Hegel's idea that we are a product of our own period. For Tolstoy, leaders are like great men pushed to the front. Historical events happen because of thousands of smaller events that lead up to that big event, i.e. great wars. This same rule applies to the decision of an individual. For example, who to marry, what career to pick, even what to eat. There are thousands of conscious and subconscious triggers that lead up to you making a decision. Necessity, i.e. survival, forces us to act, but sometimes we also act because we want to thrive and dominate. Wars are often like wildfire, sometimes spontaneous and sometimes caused by arson. History is the same. Society is made up of millions of individuals. Each individual is made up of millions of cells. The unconscious universal swarm of life of humanity is often the blind force behind historical events. Tolstoy finally settles that free will does not exist. We all have to obey the strict rules of the hive we live in. Here's a quote. Speaking of the interaction of heat and electricity and of atoms, we cannot say why this occurs, and we say that it is because it's inconceivable otherwise, because it must be so, and that is a law. The same applies to historical events. Why war and revolution occur, we do not know. We only know that to produce the one or the other action people combine in certain formation in which they all take part, and we say that this is because it is unthinkable otherwise, or in other words, that is a law. So for Tolstoy, free will is more like an illusion. He says, the great natural forces lie outside us and we are not conscious of them. We call those forces gravitation, inertia, electricity, animal force, and so on. But we are conscious of the force of life in man. We call that freedom. Now I'll discuss a few interesting points in War and Peace. Tolstoy paints his characters as real people with genuine emotions, flaws, inconsistencies, and should be copied by all novelists. Every human being has flaws and good qualities. Simon Schama, the British historian, sums up very well. Tolstoy didn't write characters, he wrote people. That is so true. You get to know his characters so well. History is a lot more random than historians tend to make. Historians tend to explain history in a way that things happen for a reason or a rational explanation. But Tolstoy thinks history is packed with emotional outbursts, spontaneous events, just like real person lives their life full of spontaneous action. History is a lot more random than historians tend to make. Life is a struggle. War and peace cannot exist without the other. In every aspect of life, there is a battle going on. Even falling in love and getting married is like going to war. Family life is full of battles, so Tolstoy juxtaposes war with family life. Family loyalty is like nationalism, being loyal to a country and society. Society nourishes us, but also corrupts us. Humans are the same in every country. You just need to peel a layer to recognize that we're all the same. Tolstoy contrasts social warmth, friendship, family, and camaraderie among soldiers with the cold of unhappy family, enemies, and violence. So society is the cause of our happiest experience in life and also unhappiest experiences. Tolstoy points out that those at the top, aristocrats, have a fake kind of honor and courage, while the common soldiers and peasants have real courage and make real sacrifices. War and Peace is a great mirror of society, how people decide their priorities and cope with their mistakes and how they amend those mistakes. The Russian title of War and Peace could also mean war in the world. Vaina means war. Mir in Russian means both peace and the world. So the name Vladimir literally means a boy who rules the world. So Tolstoy's novel is really about how society functions. Of course, today, War and Peace is used to torture Russian kids in schools, as it is a compulsory read as far as I know. Be happy that you don't live in Russia. Tolstoy was interested in Europe and he characterized each nation thus, which is pretty funny, I thought. Here we go. Only Germans are self-confident on the basis of an abstract notion, science, that is, the supposed knowledge of absolute truth. A Frenchman is self-assured because he regards himself personally, both in mind and body, as irresistibly attractive to men and women. An Englishman is self-assured as being a citizen of the best organized state in the world, and therefore, as an Englishman always knows what he should do and knows that all he does as an Englishman is undoubtedly correct. An Italian is self-assured because he is excitable and easily forgets himself and other people. A Russian is self-assured just because he knows nothing and does not want to know anything, since he does not believe that anything can be known. The German self-assurance is, worst of all, stronger and more repulsive than any other, because he imagines that he knows the truth, science, which he himself has invented, but which is for him the absolute truth. How do you know that the men of genius whom all the world trusts have not also seen visions? In Russian literature, Tolstoy is the great sociologist, Dostoevsky the astute psychologist, and Turgenev a great artist, Gogol a comic genius, Pushkin and Lermontov great romantic poets. But what about Anton Chekhov, the father of short stories? He didn't moralize like Tolstoy. He didn't psychoanalyze like Dostoevsky. He didn't talk of nihilism like Turgenev. He was an artist of the mundane. He captured life as it is, not as it ought to be. His storytelling style has given us the term Chekhov's gun, a storytelling device. His influence on writers who came after him was immense. For example, you can see Chekhov's pessimism in the works by Albert Camus and Franz Kafka. As a doctor, Chekhov saw the brutal reality of existence, people battling with terrible illnesses to survive for another day. So to escape this harsh reality, he took refuge in literature. He says, quote, "Medicine is my lawful wife and literature is my mistress." So today I'll discuss his life, tell you about some of his stories, and discuss his genius writing style. I will also tell you how and why Chekhov revolutionized Russian literature and storytelling in general. I will also make a comparison between Chekhov and Albert Camus, especially on their life's philosophy that we are not driven by will to live, nor power, nor happiness, but something else. So get yourself some Russian vodka and let's talk Chekhov. Anton Chekhov was born in 1860 in Taganrog in the south of Russia, just 1 year before the emancipation of serfs in 1861. Also, 1860s is one of the most important decades in Russian literature that produced Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and Tolstoy's War and Peace. So baby Chekhov was growing up while Russia was waking up as a literary giant. Unlike most Russian writers, Chekhov was born into a merchant family close to the peasantry, and his grandpa was a serf, so he understood life at the bottom. Like Kafka, Chekhov's father plays a lot of negative male roles in his short stories. His mother told him many stories, which must have inspired Chekhov to do the same, tell stories. Chekhov says of his parents, quote, "Our talents we got from our father, but our soul from our mother." He attended a Greek school where he ironically failed the main subject, Greek. Greek is not an easy language. But things were not looking up in Chekhov's family. When he was 16, his father went bankrupt in 1876. To avoid jail, which Charles Dickens' father and Cervantes' father had to endure, Chekhov's father was smart, so he fled to Moscow, leaving the little Chekhov to deal with the money issues by selling the household stuff and talking to the bailiffs. Not only that, he managed to work by drawing, writing funny stories for the newspaper, and tutoring children so he could send money to his family in Moscow. Not just that, he also wrote funny letters to his family to cheer them up. What a son! Kudos to the teenage Chekhov. Most teenagers dream of having such freedom, but little we know that it always comes with responsibility. The teenage Chekhov had to help his family financially and keep their morale by telling great stories. To pass the time, Chekhov also read a lot of fiction like Don Quixote, Oblomov, Fathers and Sons, and philosophical books like Schopenhauer's Will and Representation. He was also busy chasing women, having affairs with older women, including the wife of one of his teachers. He really was walking in the shoes of a grown-up man. In 1879, when he was 19, he managed to join his family in Moscow. Not only that, he managed to enter Moscow State Medical University. The man was a genius. Without help from his parents, he did all of that. It took him 4 years to get his doctor's qualification from universities, so in 1884 he started working for little or no money treating the poor. He had come from poverty and he wanted to give something back. But it all had come at a cost to his own health. A year after starting work as a physician, he contracted tuberculosis, but he kept it hidden from his family despite coughing blood. All the while, he wrote short stories like crazy to make enough money for his family to move to a better place. Just like Franz Kafka, it was his writing that kept him going. Things were looking up as his stories were appreciated by many readers. It's amazing how readers can help keep an artist alive simply by appreciating the art. Not just readers, he also became well known among the intellectuals and writers. In 1888, Chekhov's book, At Dusk, a collection of short stories, won the prestigious Pushkin Prize. Now Russia had a new 26-year-old artistic genius in the making. Dostoevsky had died in 1881 and Tolstoy was getting old, so Russia needed a younger blood, and Chekhov announced himself, not by writing big brick-like novels, but short stories. In 1887, while traveling through the steppes of Ukraine, Chekhov was inspired to write a short story titled Steppe that was published in a literary journal, not some cheap newspaper. That same year, he was commissioned to write a play titled Ivanov, which became a huge success due to its realism. Chekhov became the painter of reality like no one else. He painted the mundane and the everyday. This was revolutionary. But most crucially, by writing a play, he learned that he couldn't afford to write more or less, but what was needed to tell the story. This became known as Chekhov's gun. What does it mean? It basically boils down to this, that everything in the story should have a purpose. Quote, remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say it in the first chapter that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. In other words, every object in the story is required. Nothing extra or superfluous should be mentioned. He invented the art of tidy storytelling that has become mainstream today. In 1890, Chekhov took his gun, just kidding, no gun, and headed east to a penal colony on the island of Sakhalin, just north of Japan. This trip was an eye-opener for him. He witnessed so many horror stories of how cruel human can be. He wrote, quote, there were times I felt that I saw before me the extreme limits of man's degradation. He even witnessed the children as young as 6 following their chained, convicted fathers and sleeping in the same room with other criminals. Just like Dostoevsky, Chekhov understood how complex humanity was. Despite their gruesome crimes, he wanted the authorities to treat the convicts more humanely. His Sakhalin writing has been incredibly influential not only on the issue of human rights but also on other writers including Haruki Murakami and Seamus Heaney, both of whom has dedicated something in their own works. Also, I should make comparison between him and George Orwell's writing while homeless in Paris and London, as well as his travels to Wigan Pier. So to become a writer with depth, one must see harsh reality of life. Tolstoy fought in the Crimean War of 1850s, while Dostoevsky spent years in the Siberian labor camp as a prisoner. On his return from Sakhalin, Chekhov became serious in his medical practice. Quote, if I'm a doctor, then I need sick people in a hospital. And if I'm a writer, then I need to live among people, not on Malaya Dmitrovka, a posh street in Moscow. And I need a piece of social and political life. So he moved to a village some 80 kilometers south of Moscow, a place called Melikhovo, where he spent about 6 years practicing as a doctor, but also writing some of his best works. For example, in 1894, he wrote The Seagull, one of his greatest plays. 2 years later, he wrote Uncle Vanya. Also around this time, Chekhov said goodbye to God and religion to become an atheist. He had seen so much suffering, especially among children, that shook his faith in God Almighty sitting pretty while all these kids were dying for no reason. His own health was also getting worse, so he made a move to a warmer place. In 1898, he bought a house and moved to Crimea, where he would entertain giants like Leo Tolstoy and Maxim Gorky. Here he also wrote some of his best plays like The Cherry Orchard. Not just that, he also married Olga, but they lived somewhat independent lives, Chekhov in Crimea and Olga in Moscow. The long-distance relationship must have been good and bad, but around this time, Chekhov wrote one of his most famous short stories, The Lady with a Dog, about the love affair between two married people, so who knows, he might have had something going. Everything starts with a casual encounter and soon gets very serious very quickly. Life, however, is very cruel. Chekhov's health continued to deteriorate. He made a trip to a small town in Germany. He would not return to Russia alive. He died on July 15, 1904, aged 44. His body was taken to Russia and buried in Moscow next to his father. He was one of the most famous writers in Russia at the time, perhaps only second to Tolstoy. But what's remarkable is that Tolstoy didn't have to work a day in his life. I mean to earn a living, because he was a count, meaning he had a lot of disposable income passed on to him from his family. Chekhov had to work his arse off to feed his family even as a teenager. Even as a doctor, he worked among the poorest of the poor. But despite all his hardship and suffering he encountered, he made the most of his life by writing some of the most beautiful stories you will ever read. Dark, humorous, pessimistic, but they're all real. Genuine stories of genuine people. He was writing about people who had no voice in literature, to the point that his writing was laughed at in some circles as unattractive and unappealing as human waste, as one British journalist put it. But slowly he found his readers in the West, especially among the new breed of writers such as James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, George Bernard Shaw, Ernest Hemingway, Vladimir Nabokov, and later on Raymond Carver. Today, Chekhov is recognized as one of the geniuses of Russia who revolutionized storytelling by focusing on the ordinary and turning them into extraordinary stories. Today, Chekhov is considered the father of short stories and one of the finest Russian writers of all time. For the summary of some of Chekhov's stories, I reached out to Chekhov and Chill on Instagram, who kindly read and summarized 2 of Chekhov's best short stories and 2 plays here for you to see and judge the genius of Russian doctor-turned-artist. I'll leave her Instagram link in the description, so go and follow her for great content on Russian literature. Man in a Case. Chekhov wrote Man in a Case in 1898. Some say it was written in response to Tolstoy's short story How Much Land Does a Man Need?, in which a man who is so greedy that he perishes in his pursuit of owning more land. Tolstoy finally buries his character in a tiny grave as an ironic answer to the question, how much land does a man really need? What is the story of a man in a case? Teacher narrates to his friend the story of one of his former colleagues, an absurdly reclusive Greek teacher named Belikov. Belikov is someone who takes every effort not only to remove himself from any kind of community, progress, and joy, but ensures that those around him do the same. He isolates himself physically, walking around in constant shroud of dark coats, hats, sunglasses, and umbrellas, but nevertheless imposes his presence on others, coming to the apartments of his colleagues and sitting there for hours in complete silence. His fear of change spreads to those around him, and the whole town is kept in dread and stagnation by his presence. Things change when a new teacher, Kovalenko, comes to town with his sister, Varenka. These newcomers are cheerful and charming, and even Belikov finds himself gravitating towards Varenka. The townspeople start bringing Belikov and Varenka together, hoping for a marriage, but Belikov hesitates to take his major step. One day, Belikov sees Varenka riding a bicycle with her brother. He is scandalized by this and comes to Kovalenko to complain. Kovalenko, however, takes none of his nonsense and throws him down the stairs. Varenka witnesses the end of this scene and laughs at Belikov. This is too much for Belikov to bear, so he falls ill and dies soon after, looking happier than ever in his coffin. The townspeople are momentarily relieved to be free of his oppressing presence, but soon find themselves reverting back to the same stagnation that they lived in before, proving that while Belikov took living in a case to the extreme, people confine themselves to cases all on their own. Gooseberries. Published in 1898, Gooseberries is a short story by Anton Chekhov. What's the story? A veterinarian narrates to his friend the story of his younger brother, Nikolai. Nikolai devoted his whole life to one goal, to buy the state of his dreams, one with gooseberry bushes. As Nikolai works towards his goal, he becomes twisted and corrupt, even starving his elderly wife to save money for the state. Eventually, he does purchase the state, and the narrator recounts visiting him there. Nikolai's state is a twisted version of his idealized dream. It is polluted, bare, and corrupt, reflecting the soul of its owner. Still, Nikolai fools himself into thinking that his goals have been achieved, and the narrator finds himself repulsed by his brother's greed, apathy, and delusional sense of self-importance. Disturbed and disgusted by the encounter, the narrator muses on how easy it is for those who achieve positions of privilege to remain in self-satisfied complacency and ignores the suffering that occurs around them. Here's a quote from the story. And such a state of things is evidently necessary. Obviously, the happy man is at ease only because the unhappy ones bear their burdens in silence. If there were not this silence, happiness would be impossible. It's a general hypnosis. Behind the door of every contented, happy man, there ought to be someone standing with little hammer and continually reminding him with a knock that they are unhappy people, that however happy he may be, life will sooner or later show him its claws. The trouble will come to him, illness, poverty, losses, and then no one will see or hear him, just as now he neither sees nor hears others. But there is no man with a hammer. The happy man lives at his ease, faintly fluttered by small daily cares, like an aspen in the wind, and all is well. The Seagull is a play written in 1895 and first performed in 1896. It tells the story of Konstantin, a young, sensitive man hoping to become a playwright. He lives with his uncle on a country estate. His mother, Arkadina, is an egotistical and overbearing actress visiting the state with her lover Trigorin, a famous writer. Konstantin is in love with Nina, a young girl who lives nearby and hopes to become an actress herself. Other characters gather around the stage to watch Konstantin's attempt at a play, including the philosophical and detached Dr. Dorn and the almost comically gloomy Masha. Various love triangles and complex relationships form. Notably, Nina falls for Trigorin. 2 years later, the same group gathers at the very same state. Nina's life has been tragically marked by her romance with Trigorin, who abandoned her and went back to Arkadina, and her failure as an actress. Konstantin, already depressed, is even further devastated by the encounter with her. The play ends with Konstantin's suicide. It's here that Chekhov's famous gun is at play. Also, the play alludes to Shakespeare's Hamlet through various similarities. The Cherry Orchard was written in 1903 and published a year later. The play opens with Lyubov Andreevna Ranevskaya returning to her childhood home from Paris. The Ranevsky estate used to be grand and prosperous, and their cherry orchard was a point of fame and pride. But times have changed. The orchard no longer bears fruits and the family is broke. Lyubov Andreevna and most of her family are hopelessly stuck in the past, unable to accept their imminent financial ruin, much less do anything to prevent it. The family is offered a solution by Lopakhin, a wealthy merchant whose forefathers were serfs on the estate, and who has been in love with Ranevskaya since childhood. However, the family is ultimately unable to take action. Lopakhin ends up buying the estate, intending to chop down the orchard to make room for cottages. On the scale of one family and state, Chekhov tells the story of an entire country on the verge of transformation. Style. Nothing is resolved. One of the first things you notice when you read Chekhov is that he never gives you an answer to life's problems. It feels as though his stories are abandoned. He just paints life as it is. This was in reaction to other Russian writers who came before him. I would say in particular in response to Tolstoy, who never stopped moralizing in his books. Dostoevsky too had a political stance in his novels, especially his anti-Western sentiment. So naturally, Chekhov took a neutral stance towards morality, politics, and religion. He just looked at reality and reported how he saw it. And that made him very unique and distinct from other Russian writers. In many ways, he's a bit closer to Turgenev, as both were genuinely artists first. If you have read him and think Chekhov's stories may seem inconclusive, you're not alone. Here's a quote from the English novelist Virginia Woolf. "But is it the end?" we ask. We have rather the feeling that we have overrun our signals, or it is as if a tune had stopped short without the expected chords to close it. These stories are inconclusive, we say, and proceed to frame a criticism based upon the assumption that these stories ought to conclude in a way that we recognize. In so doing, we raise the question of our own fitness as readers, where the tune is familiar and the end emphatic, lovers united, villains discomfited, intrigues exposed, as it is in most Victorian fiction, we can scarcely go wrong. But where the tune is unfamiliar and the end a note of interrogation or merely the information that they went on talking, as it is in Chekhov, we need a very daring and alert sense of literature to make us hear the tune, and in particular those last notes which complete the harmony. Basically, Chekhov didn't want to change the world based on a particular value system. As a doctor, he couldn't judge people, and as an artist and a storyteller, he kept his tales as objective as possible. Here's a quote: "I think that it's not for writers to solve such questions as the existence of God, pessimism, etc. The writer's function is only to describe by whom, how, and under what conditions the questions of God and pessimism were discussed." Another important element of Chekhov's storytelling is minimalistic description. Today, Chekhov's gun simply means only stick to what is important to the story. Do not introduce a gun in scene 1 unless it goes off by the end of the story. In other words, keep your stories as minimal and precise as possible. Remove all the fluffs and keep it to its bare bones, so to speak. Why? Because peasants don't have time to fluff. Chekhov understood that to get someone's attention, you must stick to what is important. Don't digress and don't talk about things that are not related to the story. In novels, you can get away with some fluff or digression, but in short stories, things are much more brutal. It's survivor of the finest, so minimalism has become synonymous with Chekhov's style. Here's what Maxim Gorky talks about Chekhovian simplicity. Quote, "In the presence of Anton Pavlovich Chekhov, everyone felt an unconscious desire to be simpler, more truthful, more himself. And I had many opportunities of observing how people threw off their attire of grand bookish phrases, fashionable expressions, and all the rest of the cheap trifles with which Russians, in their anxiety to appear Europeans, adorn themselves, as savages deck themselves with shells and fishes' teeth." Chekhov emphasized the unsaid, silence, pauses, everything in between. Instead of adding more words, he focused on what was unsaid, unverbalized. Human communication is often more non-verbal than verbal, so Chekhov was good at articulating the full spectrum of human communication, and often that means saying less is more. Follow intuition. Chekhov's stories are tales of the mundane. He didn't write about some great wars like Tolstoy did, or deep philosophical debates like Dostoevsky or Turgenev did, or social change like Gogol or Pushkin did. Instead, Chekhov wrote about the ordinary. How can you turn ordinary or banal into a work of art? Here comes intuition. Intuition is often defined as a quick, natural response we have to what we see or experience. It's the immediate response. So normally women claim to have a superior intuition than men because they notice smaller things, while men tend to focus on bigger things. Chekhov moved away from philosophy and politics and instead relied on his intuition to turn everyday people and experiences into great stories. Ultimately, we all, irrespective of our jobs and status, have an everyday life. We wake up, eat breakfast, put on our clothes, commute to work, sit in the office, talk to colleagues, go home, watch telly, and go to bed. There is nothing magical in our lives, so Chekhov understood the banality of life and made that his muse. What Chekhov saw was social paradoxes. He saw the contradictions between doctor and patients, between men and women, and between rich and poor. His stories are tales of juxtaposition between two opposites. We might not notice the power play between two people is always at play, but not always obvious. Chekhov, as a doctor, himself saw the powerlessness of patients, but most crucially the powerlessness of doctors in the face of immense human suffering. Here's an interesting fact. Chekhov was an obsessive gardener. He looked after plants. His short stories are about people as if they are plants. Humans are just plants in a garden we call society or a country. Some are weak, some are strong. They live in the same garden, yet each one has a different existence. Such is the nature of reality. This was revolutionary in Russia at the time. People were used to novels being moralistic, so their novels were packed with ideas and teachings. But Chekhov stripped his stories of any teaching. He wrote what he saw. He didn't judge them, he just depicted them as they were. Telling the truth, I have said this before that one of the most brilliant aspects of Russian literature is its brutal honesty in revealing the darker side of life. While literature is sometimes considered an escape from reality, Russian literature for me is a massive punch in the face that wakes you up to the harsher truths of life. Chekhov is no different from Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. He tells the truth as it is. And what's different about Chekhov is that he tells the truth from all sides. In Tolstoy's writings, and to some extent Dostoevsky's and Turgenev's writings, they idolize the Russian peasants as almost godly and the source of inspirations. This makes sense because these writers came from an aristocratic background, so they felt that they had to revere the peasant, but also because peasants lived a more honest lives compared to the nobility who were pretentious and kept appearances. Now, Chekhov doesn't paint a rosy picture of the peasants. He saw them just as flawed as the aristocrats. He saw them as dishonest at times as the ruling elite. Chekhov saw human nature in action. He didn't use his own preconception of how people behave. He saw how people behaved in real life. They lie, they steal, they do bad things as well as great things. So unlike other Russian writers, Chekhov didn't romanticize the Russian peasants. Here's a quote. A creed that teaches indifference to wealth, indifference to the convenience of life, and contempt for suffering is quite incomprehensible to the great majority who never knew either wealth or the convenience of life, to whom contempt for suffering would mean contempt for their own lives, which are made up of feelings of hunger, cold, loss, insult, and a Hamlet-like terror of death. All life lies in these feelings, and life may be hated or weary of, but never despised. Yes, I repeat it, the teachings of the Stoics can never have a future. From the beginning of time, life has consisted in sensibility to pain in response to irritation. Will to joy. Schopenhauer said that we're driven by a blind will to life. We work and struggle to continue on living. Nietzsche said we're driven by will to power, but because we all want to be respected by our competence and power. Chekhov, however, says we are ultimately driven by a will to joy. Chekhov's stories are full of magical moments. He saw genuine joy in the midst of misery and hardship. It is these tiny moments that we really cherish in life. Yes, we love little moments of joys. That's our energy and that motivates us. Happiness is meaningless because it presupposes that we will be happy for a long period of life. But joy is always temporary, which is the truer goal of human existence. We live for these moments of joy. No matter how high a mountain we conquer, it's the joyous moment that motivates us and gives us enormous satisfaction. Chekhov's comedy is always an awkward moment, an inappropriate moment which is paradoxical. While reading him, you notice the little things people do that bring a smile to your face. We all experience these things. In the midst of our hectic lives, we often see a little moment of joy. For example, a stranger smiling at you, someone keeping a door open for you, a cat walking past you. It makes sense because Chekhov lived with an illness himself, just like Camus, who was also suffering from tuberculosis for most of his life. He knew that death was looming large. What makes humans distinct from other animals that we anticipate our death. Other animals may understand when it comes to them, but we know our demise from an early period of life. So Chekhov not only anticipated his own death, he saw death on a daily basis as a doctor. As Martin Heidegger said, the true meaning of life is understanding that we have a finite amount of time. This awareness gives our lives authenticity. So Chekhov's stories are a snapshot of life, and moments of tragedy sprinkled with moments of joy. That's real life. No matter who you are, we all live in a mundane life, and these moments of joy are precious, no matter how miserable life can be. Chekhov and Camus had a lot in common. Both suffered from the same illness, tuberculosis. They also had a deep love for storytelling, especially theater. They also shared a philosophy that life is made of little moments of joy. Camus' myth of Sisyphus is precisely that. Sisyphus is condemned to push a rock up a mountain. Perhaps his only joy is the short interval between him getting to the top before he has to go back down. It's the same for us all. Our little moments of joy is meeting a friend, having a nice meal, sharing a drink, talking to loved ones, getting a nice comments from you beautiful people on YouTube, etc. A long, continuous state of happiness is a myth pushed onto us by fairy tales like Cinderella. Anton Chekhov is funny like Gogol, artistic like Turgenev, profound like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but he was different from all of them. He rose from the bottom of the Russian society, so he understood real pain and real suffering. As a dutiful doctor and objective artist, he removed himself from his stories. His opinions or worldview didn't matter. He made himself invisible in his stories. His stories are all about the characters. He didn't care about how the world should be or how we can make things better. All Chekhov was concerned was to depict the world how it was. Reality, that's it. To the point that sometimes he appears heartless. Chekhov depicts nature and reality without moral judgment. He was a doctor educated in physical science, therefore everything had to be concretized. For example, a man falls in love with a woman for her white teeth or her breasts. Shallow? Yes, but nature is deep and shallow. We all are. That is Chekhov's intuition that saw the paradox of life. Dostoevsky wanted Russia to return to its olden traditional values. Tolstoy wanted Russia to be more just towards the poor. Turgenev wanted liberal values to take root in Russia. Maxim Gorky wanted a socialist society that promoted equality for all. Chekhov, however, didn't write about how society should be. He wrote about what it is. He wrote about life's reality as it is. I'll leave you with a quote from another Russian writer, Vladimir Nabokov. Chekhov's genius almost involuntarily disclosed more of the blackest realities of hungry, puzzled, servile, angry peasant Russia than a multitude of other writers, such as Gorky, for instance, who flaunted their social ideas in a precision of painted dummies. I shall go further and say that the person who prefers Dostoevsky or Gorky to Chekhov will never be able to grasp the essentials of Russian literature and Russian life. If you have made it this far, well done. For me, Russian literature is one of the best in the world. I am absolutely in love with Russian literature. There are a few reasons. First, I love the raw honesty in Russian novels. There is no sugarcoating or dilly-dallying about life or the human condition. Another reason I love Russian novels is they're mostly novels of ideas. They go deep philosophically, psychologically, and sociologically. The Russians learned novel writings from the French, and instead of just copying them, they decided to take it much deeper, farther into the recesses of socio-political entanglements and human psyche. They captured the modern condition beautifully, a godless world free from traditions yet terrifying at the same time. Pushkin captured the reality of the human heart despite the socio-political landscape of change. Lermontov described the male psyche, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Gogol depicted a new merchant class who would do anything to get rich, often in comical fashion. Goncharov portrayed the laziness of the Russian aristocrats in the face of change coming from Western Europe. Turgenev dissected the nihilistic tendencies among the Russian intellectuals. Tolstoy captured the nightmares of groups, armies, governments, and nations. Dostoevsky captured the nightmares of the individuals. These novels could be set anywhere in the world, and they would describe the people. The reason they are loved universally is because these novels were about the human condition. Despite our cultural differences, we can all relate to these novels, their characters, and worldviews. Thank you for accompanying me on this long journey. Let me know what you think. Did I miss someone? Who is your favorite novelist, or what is your favorite Russian novel of all time? Спасибо большое.